Hello and welcome to Anana's Creation. Today we begin a new journey, a deep dive into a story you might think you know, but I promise you've never heard it like this before. We are peeling back the layers of myth and monstrosity to uncover the heart of a tragedy. This is the tragic story of Medusa, more than just a monster. Let us begin before the whispers turn to warnings, before a name could curdle the air and turn blood to ice. She was just Maria. A name as gentle as the coastal breeze that swept through the marbled avenues of the city of Ethel. Ethel wasn't just a place, it was a promise. A promise of culture, of innovation, of reaching towards a sky that held no limits. Its buildings, pristine and ivory white, seemed not to be built upon the earth, but to have grown from it, like ancient, majestic trees of stone and glass. And at the very heart of this gleaming metropolis stood the Athenaeum, a sanctuary of knowledge, art and wisdom, presided over by the formidable and brilliant Dr. Anya Sharma. Dr. Sharma was more than the director of the Athenaeum, she was its living soul. A woman of sharp intellect and an even sharper gaze, she commanded respect not through force but through an unwavering dedication to principle. To the young women who served and studied under her, she was a goddess in a perfectly tailored suit, her words carving paths to enlightenment. And among all her acolytes, none was more devout, more utterly dedicated than Maria. Maria's life was a tapestry woven with threads of discipline and devotion. Her days began before the sun, its first pale rays finding her already within the hallowed halls of the Athenaeum's grand library, the scent of old paper and polished wood her morning incense. Her hair, a cascade of spun bronze and gold, was her only vanity. It flowed down her back, a silent testament to a beauty she acknowledged but never worshipped. For Maria, true beauty lay in order, in knowledge, in the quiet, unyielding pursuit of wisdom that Dr. Sharma championed. She believed in the sanctity of this place with a purity that was almost breathtaking. To her, the Athenaeum was not merely a building, it was a fortress against the chaos of the world outside. Its rules were not restrictions, but armor. And the most sacred of these rules was the vow of focus, a commitment to let no worldly distraction, no fleeting passion, taint the pursuit of one's potential. It was a vow Maria had taken with every fiber of her being. Her world was one of quiet corridors, of muted footsteps on mosaic floors, of the hushed rustle of turning pages. Her companions were the great thinkers of history, their voices whispering to her from the endless shelves. She was content. More than content, she was fulfilled. She felt seen, not for the startling green of her eyes or the perfect curve of her smile, but for the fierce intelligence and the quiet strength that resided within her. Dr. Sharma herself had praised Maria's dedication, once remarking that her mind was as beautifully ordered as the Athenaeum's own archives. For Maria, there could be no higher compliment. But even a fortress has gates, and the world has a way of finding its way inside. The Athenaeum was a beacon, and it drew all sorts of people to its light. Among them was Preston. Preston was everything Ethel celebrated on the surface and everything Dr. Sharma cautioned against in private. He was a titan of industry, his empire built on the shifting sands of commerce and influence. His name was whispered in boardrooms and etched onto the cornerstones of skyscrapers. He moved with the effortless confidence of a man who had never been told no, his charisma a powerful tide that pulled others into his orbit. He was a significant patron of the Athenaeum, his generous donations ensuring its continued preeminence. And for that reason, he was a frequent and honored guest. Maria first saw him during the annual Benefactors Gala. The great hall was alive with the low hum of polite conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses. Maria and the other acolytes moved silently through the crowd, their simple gray robes a stark contrast to the glittering jewels and silks of the city's elite. She was refilling a water carafe when a voice, deep and smooth as aged whiskey, spoke from just behind her. Such quiet diligence in a room full of peacocks. It's refreshing. She turned, startled, to find Preston watching her. His eyes were the color of the deep ocean, mesmerizing and dangerous. He smiled, a slow, deliberate act that seemed to command all the attention in the room. Maria felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his compliment, and turned to leave. "Wait," he said, his voice softer now, yet more commanding. "I don't believe I know your name." "It is not important, sir," Maria replied, her gaze fixed on the marble floor. "I am here to serve the Athenaeum." "But you have a name," he persisted, taking a step closer. The air around him smelled of salt and distant storms. A face like yours deserves a name to go with it. Maria, she said, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. Maria, he repeated, tasting the name. A beautiful name for a beautiful woman. Tell me, Maria, do you ever leave these hallowed halls? Do you ever let that magnificent hair down and feel the sea spray on your face? His words were like stones tossed into the placid pool of her existence. They were presumptuous, intimate. They violated the unspoken rules of her world. My life is here, she stated, her voice regaining its composure. My work is my focus. All work and no play, Preston chuckled, a low rumbling sound. Even the brightest stars must fall into the ocean sometimes. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was proper, a silent challenge in his eyes, before he was swept away by a group of city councilmen. Maria stood frozen for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. The encounter left a strange residue, like a film of sea salt on her skin. It was unsettling. She quickly pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to the unfamiliarity of such direct, personal attention. She was a servant of wisdom, a student of Dr. Sharma. The fleeting interest of a powerful man meant nothing. She was shielded by the walls of the Athenaeum, protected by her vow. She was safe. But as she moved through the rest of her duties that evening, she could feel his eyes on her from across the room. A persistent, unwavering gaze that felt less like admiration and more like an assessment. Like a claim being staked. The quiet, ordered world she had so carefully constructed had just been breached, and a cold tendril of fear, faint but undeniable, coiled in the pit of her stomach. Promise of Ethel had always been one of limitless opportunity, but for the first time, Maria began to wonder what lurked in the shadows of that promise. She was just Maria. But she was beginning to feel that for a man like Preston, that was more than enough. The benefactors' gala ended, and the vibrant silks and loud conversations of Ethel's elite receded, leaving the Athenaeum to its familiar, sacred silence. But for Maria, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was filled with the echo of a voice as deep as the ocean and the memory of a gaze that felt like a physical touch. Preston's presence lingered in the air like a phantom, a disruption to the perfect, logical order of her world. She scrubbed the marble floors with more vigor than necessary, as if she could erase the lingering memory of his footsteps. She lost herself in translating ancient, complex texts, hoping the discipline would quiet the unsettling rhythm of her own heart. She tried to convince herself that the encounter was meaningless, a fleeting moment of vanity from a powerful man used to getting what he wanted. He would forget her. Life would return to its serene, predictable pattern. But Preston was not a man who forgot. In the weeks that followed, his presence at the Athenaeum became a near-constant fixture. He cited a newfound, passionate interest in historical acquisitions, using his status as a patron to gain unprecedented access. He would appear, unannounced, in the tranquil gardens where Maria tended to the ancient olive trees. He would materialize in the hushed corridors of the archives, his expensive leather shoes making an unnervingly loud sound on the polished floors. His reasons were always plausible, his demeanor always charming to anyone else who might be watching. But his eyes, they were always seeking her. His conversations started innocently enough. He would ask about the manuscript she was restoring or the history of a particular sculpture. Maria would answer with professional brevity, her voice polite but cool, her gaze directed at her work, never at him. But he would always find a way to steer the conversation into more personal territory. "That color suits you, Maria," he'd comment on the simple gray of her acolyte's robe. "Or a mind like yours must get tired of all this dust. You belong out in the sun where people can appreciate you." Each comment was a subtle chisel, chipping away at the walls she had so carefully built around herself. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, every detail of her existence being observed, catalogued, and claimed. Her focus, once as sharp as a laser, began to fray at the edges. She found herself pausing in her work, listening for his footsteps. She began choosing different routes through the Athenaeum, seeking the most secluded paths to avoid any chance of an encounter. The sanctuary had started to feel like a cage, and she was a bird frantically searching for a corner where the hawk could not see her. Her devotion, once her greatest strength, was now a chain. She was bound to this place, the very place her predator had chosen for his hunting ground. Dr. Anya Sharma did not miss the subtle shift in her most promising student. She saw the new tension in Maria's shoulders, the faint dark circles that had appeared beneath her vibrant green eyes. One afternoon, as Maria was shelving books in Dr. Sharma's private study, the older woman spoke without looking up from her desk. "The world outside these walls is governed by appetite, Maria. Men of great power often have the greatest appetites. They see beauty and they believe it is a feast laid out for them alone. Do not mistake a wolf's hunger for admiration." The words hung in the air, pointed and heavy. Maria froze, her hand hovering over a leather-bound volume. She wanted to confide in Dr. Sharma, to pour out the fear and confusion that had taken root in her heart. But what could she say? That a man had complimented her? That he looked at her too long? In the harsh light of logic, her fears felt flimsy, almost childish. Accusing a man like Preston, the Athenaeum's greatest benefactor based on a feeling, seemed like a monumental folly. It would be her word, the word of a quiet acolyte, against his. So she said nothing, merely nodding. "I understand, Doctor. Wisdom is the only shield." Dr. Sharma finally looked up, her gaze piercing. "Wisdom is a shield, Maria. But some storms require more than a shield. They require you to be the rock that breaks the wave. Do not forget the strength you have." It was the closest she would come to offering direct help, a lesson couched in metaphor. The responsibility, the solution, was being placed squarely back on Maria's shoulders. The breaking point came a week later. The Athenaeum was preparing for a rare celestial event, a solar eclipse that hadn't been seen in over a century. The entire staff was busy setting up telescopes and preparing viewing rooms on the East Wing. Knowing this, Maria had retreated to the West Wing's deep archives, a labyrinthine section of the library rarely visited, to finish cataloging a new acquisition of fragile scrolls. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the soft crinkle of parchment. She finally felt a moment of peace, a return to the comforting anonymity of her work. That's when she heard it. A single, deliberate footstep behind her. She didn't have to turn around. The scent of the sea, of power and expensive cologne, filled the narrow aisle. "Working so hard you'd miss the sun disappearing from the sky?" Preston's voice was a low murmur, but in the profound silence of the archive, it was as loud as a roar. Maria slowly turned, her body rigid. He was standing at the end of the aisle, blocking the only exit. His smile was gone. In its place was an expression of raw, undisguised possession. "Please, sir," Maria said, her voice trembling slightly. "This area is restricted. The artifacts are extremely delicate." "I have no interest in the artifacts," he said, taking a slow step towards her. "I'm here for the only treasure in this entire building worth possessing." She backed away, her hands pressed against the cold, unyielding shelves behind her. "I don't know what you mean. I am a student here. A servant of the Athenaeum." "Stop playing this game, Maria," he hissed, his voice losing its charming veneer and taking on a dangerous edge. He was closer now, close enough for her to see the predatory light in his eyes. "This place, with its rules and its cold wisdom, it's suffocating you. I can give you the world. Jewels, yachts, palaces that would make this dusty museum look like a pauper's hut. Everything you could ever want." "The only thing I want," Maria said, her fear giving way to a surge of defiance, "is to be left alone." His face darkened. "That," he said, closing the remaining distance between them in 2 long strides, "is the one thing I am not willing to give you." He reached out, his hand wrapping around her arm, his grip like iron. Quiet sanctuary had vanished. The marble halls no longer offered protection. The rock Dr. Sharma had told her to be was crumbling into sand, and the wave was about to crash. His grip was a manacle, cold and unyielding. For a heart-stopping moment, Maria's mind went blank, paralyzed by the sheer, brutal reality of her situation. The abstract fear she had been living with for weeks had suddenly become terrifyingly real, with a name and a face and hands that were bruising her skin. Then instinct took over. A primal scream for survival clawed its way up her throat, but his other hand clamped over her mouth, stifling the sound, the scent of his expensive cologne now sickening and suffocating. "Don't," he growled, his voice a low threat inches from her ear. "Don't make this difficult." The word difficult was a spark in the tinderbox of her terror. It was so outrageously unjust that it ignited a fire of pure rage within her. This was her home. This was a place of knowledge, of sanctity. She was not a prize to be taken, an object to be possessed. She was Maria. With a surge of adrenaline, she thrashed against him, kicking, twisting, her fingers clawing at the hand over her face. She was strong, her body conditioned by years of disciplined work, but he was a force of nature, a tempest of entitlement and raw power. He easily overpowered her, his weight pinning her against the towering shelves. The ancient, fragile scrolls rattled, whispering their protest as the spines of books dug into her back. Inside the tall, arched windows of the archive, the world was dimming. The rare eclipse had begun its celestial march, casting the city of Ethel in an eerie, premature twilight. As the sun was being devoured in the sky, Maria felt her own world, her own light, being extinguished. He tore at the simple gray fabric of her robe, the sound of ripping cloth a scream she could not make. Every principle she had ever held, every vow she had taken, shattered like glass. The sanctity of the Athenaeum, her belief in order and reason, her faith in the protection of wisdom, it was all a lie. There was no protection. There was only the chaos she had been taught to fear, and it was here, in the heart of her sanctuary. The assault was a violation not just of her body, but of her soul. It was a desecration of everything she was. She closed her eyes, detaching her mind from the horror, retreating to a cold, silent place deep within herself. The sounds of the struggle, her own muffled sobs, his ragged breathing, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. She focused on the patterns of the marble floor, the scent of aging paper, the last vestiges of the world that was being stolen from her. In the twilight of the eclipse, on the cold floor of the library, Maria ceased to be. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. A shadow fell over them, sharper and colder than the one cast by the dying sun. A voice, clear and cutting as a shard of ice, sliced through the thick, violated air. Preston. It was Dr. Sharma. She stood at the end of the aisle, a lone, formidable silhouette against the dim light from the corridor. Her face was an unreadable mask of stone, but her eyes, even from a distance, burned with a cold fire. She took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. Preston, hastily pulling himself together, his hair disheveled, his face flushed with exertion and surprise. And Maria, a crumpled heap on the floor, her robe torn, her body trembling with silent, convulsive sobs. Preston, ever the master of control, recovered instantly. He straightened his designer suit, smoothed his hair, and manufactured a look of deep concern. "Anya," he said, his voice regaining its smooth, reasonable tone. "Thank goodness you're here." Maria, she had some sort of episode. A hysterical fit. She grew faint, started screaming. "I was just trying to help her, to calm her down." The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it stole the breath from Maria's lungs. She tried to speak, to scream the truth, but only a choked, ragged gasp escaped her. Her voice was gone, trapped somewhere in her violated throat. She looked at Preston, this monster cloaked in civility, and then her eyes, pleading, desperate, found Dr. Sharma. "Help me," her eyes screamed. "You see the truth. Tell me you see it." Dr. Sharma's gaze drifted from Preston's composed face down to Maria on the floor. Maria searched that gaze for a flicker of compassion, of empathy, of the righteous anger a protector should feel. She found none. What she saw was far, far worse. She saw disgust. She saw a flicker of profound, icy disappointment. Dr. Sharma's eyes didn't see a victim. They saw a problem. A stain. Chaotic, emotional mess marring the pristine order of her institution. Dr. Sharma's steps were silent as she approached, her focus entirely on Maria. She looked at Maria's torn robe, her disheveled hair, that magnificent bronze and gold hair now tangled and wild, and the raw, brutalized state of her prize student. She looked at the disorder, the disruption of her perfect sanctuary. And she made her judgment. "You," Dr. Sharma said, her voice dangerously quiet. But she was not speaking to Preston. She was speaking to Maria. "You let this happen. You allowed passion to breach these walls. You broke your vow of focus. You brought this chaos into my sanctuary." The words struck Maria with more force than any physical blow. The accusation, so profoundly, impossibly unjust, was a final killing stroke. The man who had assaulted her stood there, being exonerated by a lie. And the woman she had worshipped as a goddess, her mentor and protector, was pointing the finger of blame at her. The last fragile piece of Maria's world, the tiny ember of hope that justice might prevail, was snuffed out. Preston, seeing his victory, offered a final, patronizing glance. "She needs rest," he said smoothly to Dr. Sharma. "Perhaps some time away from her duties." He then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, the sound of a predator leaving the scene of a successful hunt, utterly untouchable, utterly without consequence. Maria was left alone in the encroaching darkness, on the floor at the feet of her judge. The eclipse was reaching its totality, and the library was plunged into a deep, unnatural gloom. She looked up at Dr. Sharma, the woman who held her life in her hands, and saw no savior. She saw only the cold, unforgiving face of a goddess whose temple had been defiled, and whose wrath was now seeking an altar upon which to make its sacrifice. Maria was no longer a student. She was the offering. The world outside was cloaked in the false night of the eclipse, and within the archive the darkness was absolute. It was a cold, suffocating blanket, broken only by the imposing silhouette of Dr. Anya Sharma. For a long moment she said nothing, simply observing the broken form of the young woman she had once called her most promising student. The silence was a crucible, burning away the last of Maria's shock, leaving behind the raw, gaping wounds of betrayal and horror. Maria pushed herself up slowly, her torn robe falling around her. Every muscle ached, but it was a distant pain, a mere echo of the seismic agony in her soul. "You have failed," Dr. Sharma finally spoke, her voice devoid of any warmth, any pity. It was the voice of a judge pronouncing a sentence that had been decided long ago. "This institution is built on a foundation of order, discipline, and the intellectual rigor that separates us from the beasts. It is a fortress against the very chaos you have invited in." Maria shook her head, a violent, desperate negation. A sound finally tore from her throat, a raw, croaking whisper. He attacked me." "He is a man of appetite," Dr. Sharma countered, dismissing the assault with a wave of her hand. "A force of nature, predictable in his desires. It is the duty of the rock to stand against the tide, not to crumble into sand and welcome it. Your vanity, Maria. That was the flaw in the stone. That hair you so prized, the face you so carefully preserved. You cultivated a garden to attract wasps, and now you weep because you have been stung." The injustice was a physical poison. Maria could feel it spreading through her veins, hot and acidic. Vanity? She had lived a life of ascetic devotion. She had cherished her mind, not her face. This woman, this supposed goddess of wisdom, was twisting her reality, rewriting her very identity to fit a narrative that would absolve the powerful and condemn the victim. A wild, desperate anger, an emotion Maria had never truly known, began to bubble up from the depths of her despair. "No," Maria said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "You are wrong. This is not my fault. This is your fault. You built a fortress of paper and called it strong. You worship knowledge, but you have no wisdom. You see his power, his money, and you are blind to the monster he is." As she spoke, a strange, tingling sensation started at the base of her scalp. It was an unnerving feeling, like 1,000 insects crawling just beneath her skin. Dr. Sharma's face hardened, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure fury. "You dare? You, who have brought this filth into my halls, dare to lecture me on wisdom? Your very presence is now a contamination, a monument to weakness. You are a lesson in the failure of the flesh." Tingling on her scalp intensified, becoming a searing, agonizing burn. Maria cried out and reached for her head, her fingers tangling in her own hair. But it felt wrong. Texture, once soft and silken, was now thick, coarse, and unervingly cool to the touch. Felt alive. She pulled her hands away and stared at them in the gloom. A single strand of her once golden hair was wrapped around her finger. It was no longer hair. It was a shimmering dark green, and as she watched in abject horror, it moved. Coiled and uncoiled like a tiny sightless worm. A scream, pure and undiluted, ripped from her throat as the transformation took hold. It was a cascade of horror. The burning on her scalp was the feeling of every single hair follicle twisting, corrupting, sprouting not hair but serpents. She could feel them, a growing weight on her head, a writhing, hissing mass of living venom. They tangled and fought, their dry scales scraping against her skin, their forked tongues flicking against her ears and cheeks. She fell to her knees, clawing at her head, trying to rip the abomination out by its roots, but it was part of her. Dr. Sharma watched the horrific metamorphosis not with shock, but with a cold, grim satisfaction. "There," she whispered, as if observing a successful experiment. "The chaos you invited has found its home. The ugliness within is now made manifest for all to see." Maria's agony was so profound, so all-consuming, that she barely registered the other changes. Her skin was tightening, growing hard and cool, a patterned, scaly armor replacing her soft flesh. Her fingernails thickened and curved into talons. But the final, most terrible change happened in her eyes. She looked up, her gaze locking with Dr. Sharma's, and the sheer force of her rage, her grief, and her utter sense of betrayal coalesced into something new. Something powerful and terrible. In that moment, looking at the woman who had condemned her, Maria saw not a person but a thing of cold, unfeeling stone. And as she watched, she saw Dr. Sharma flinch. The older woman took a half step back, her composure finally cracking. A flicker of what looked like fear entered her eyes. "Get out," Dr. Sharma commanded, her voice suddenly strained. "This is no longer your home. You are a monster now, a danger to all who would look upon you. Your name is a curse. Go. Flee to the dark places of the world where you belong and never let your cursed face be seen in the light of my city again." The banishment was the final blow. Cast out. Unmade. Recast as a monster. Maria scrambled to her feet, her new body feeling alien and wrong. The hissing of the snakes on her head was a symphony of her own damnation. She gave Dr. Sharma one last look, a look that promised a future of cold, hard consequences, and then she turned and fled. She ran from the archive, from the Athenaeum, from the only life she had ever known. Her bare feet, now tough and calloused, slapped against the marble floors, the sound no longer the quiet footfall of a devout acolyte, but the desperate flight of a creature born from betrayal and forged in the crucible of an unforgiving goddess's wrath. The eclipse ended, and as the sun's light returned to the city of Ethel, Maria plunged deeper into the shadows, no longer a victim but a legend of terror about to be born. She ran. There was no thought, no direction, only a primal instinct to put as much distance as possible between herself and the cold, marbled prison that had become her place of execution. The city of Ethel, once a symbol of promise and beauty, was now a hostile landscape of sharp angles and blinding light. The sun, fully restored after its brief celestial battle, felt like a physical assault, searing her newly sensitive skin and making the shadows her only refuge. She hugged the walls of the alleyways, the rough bricks scraping against her hardened flesh, a strange, rasping sound that was entirely alien to her. Above her, the snakes that were once her hair were a constant, living torment. They were a writhing crown of despair, their collective hissing a maddening whisper in her ears. It was more than sound. She could feel their agitation, their fear, their nascent aggression as if it were her own. They were a part of her, a physical manifestation of the venom that had been poured into her soul by Preston and Dr. Sharma. With every panicked step she took, the heavy serpentine mass shifted and coiled, a constant chilling reminder of the monster she had become. Her first encounter with humanity was a brutal confirmation of her new reality. A young boy, no older than 7, chasing a red ball, rounded a corner and skidded to a halt directly in front of her. His eyes, wide and innocent, fixed on her face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The red ball dropped from his fingers and bounced away, the sound echoing loudly in the sudden, tense silence. For a fleeting, heartbreaking moment, Maria saw herself through his eyes. The writhing nest of serpents, the pale, scaly skin, the eyes that now seemed to glow with a faint, unnatural light. The boy's paralysis broke, and he let out a shriek of pure, unadulterated terror, scrambling backward and fleeing, his screams of "Monster! Monster!" carving daggers into the air. The word hammered into her, each syllable a blow. Monster. It was no longer just Dr. Sharma's accusation, it was the world's verdict. Soon others were drawn by the commotion. Faces peered from windows, doors creaked open. Gasps of horror and fear rippled through the street. People pointed, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and revulsion. No one saw a girl in distress. No one saw a victim. They saw only the creature from a nightmare, made real in the afternoon sun. Maria recoiled from their gazes as if from a physical blow and plunged deeper into the labyrinth of the city's forgotten spaces, seeking the dark, the damp, the places where no one would look. She finally found a semblance of solitude in a neglected, overgrown parquet tucked behind a row of old municipal buildings. A crumbling fountain, long since dry, sat in its center, its basin filled with dark, stagnant rainwater. She collapsed behind it, her body finally succumbing to the exhaustion of her flight and the sheer weight of her transformation. Sobs racked her body, but they were strange, guttural sounds devoid of the release of human tears. Felt as if her capacity for simple, cleansing grief had been burned away, leaving only the dry husk of agony. For hours she huddled there, hidden from the world, as the sun arced across the sky and the city's light began to fade once more, this time into a natural twilight. The snakes on her head, sensing her stillness, grew quiet, a dormant, watchful mass. In the deepening gloom, her mind, fractured by trauma, began to piece itself back together, not as it was, but as something new, something harder. She had felt the transformation, she had heard the world's judgment, but she had not yet confronted the truth of it herself. She had avoided her own reflection, terrified of the confirmation it would provide. But she knew she could not hide forever. The desire to know, as terrifying as it was, became a compulsion. Slowly, hesitantly, she crawled from behind the fountain. The sky was a dark, bruised purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The surface of the stagnant water in the fountain's basin was like a sheet of black glass, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of an insect. Her heart, or what passed for it now, hammered against her ribs. Taking a ragged breath, she forced herself to lean over the edge and look down. The face that stared back was a desecration of her memory. It was Maria, and yet it was not. The shape of the face was the same, but the skin was pale and patterned with a faint iridescent sheen like that of a reptile. The mouth was a thin, hard line. But the eyes were the epicenter of the horror. Her once soft, green eyes were now luminous, hypnotic, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were ancient eyes, filled with a terrible, cold light. And framing this monstrous visage was the true abomination. The crown of living, breathing snakes, their dark scales glistening in the faint light, their heads lifting and swaying, their forked tongues tasting the air. One of them, a viper with eyes like chips of obsidian, met her gaze in the reflection, and for a terrifying second she felt a flicker of shared, cold consciousness. A wave of vertigo and nausea washed over her. This was it. This was her. The ghost of the girl named Maria, the devout student who loved the scent of old books and the quiet order of the Athenaeum, died in that moment, drowned in the dark water of her own reflection. What was left was this creature. This ruin. She stared for a long, timeless moment, her mind teetering on the edge of madness. The grief was a vast, black ocean threatening to pull her under. But as she continued to stare at the monster in the water, another feeling began to surface, pushing through the waves of sorrow. It was a slow, burning ember of rage. This face was not her choice. This curse was not her sin. It was a judgment passed down by a false goddess and a verdict executed by a world that would rather fear a monster than condemn a powerful man. The snakes on her head began to stir again, agitated, sensing the shift in her heart. They hissed a low, menacing chorus. She didn't pull away from the reflection this time. She leaned closer. She looked into those terrible, glowing eyes and saw not just a victim, but a weapon. Dr. Sharma had called her a monster. The world had screamed the name at her. Very well. If they wanted a monster, she would show them what a monster could do. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but now it had a companion, a purpose as cold and hard and deadly as the gaze now staring back at her. Her exile had begun. Her hunt was about to. The decision to live was not a conscious one. It was a stubborn, primal instinct that survived the death of her old self. With the image of the monster in the water burned into her mind, Maria, or the creature that was once Maria, knew one thing with absolute certainty: the pristine, sunlit avenues of Ethel were a death sentence. To be seen was to be hunted. Survival meant embracing the shadows she had been cast into. She turned her back on the heart of the city and began a long, slow journey towards its frayed edges, towards the places the postcards and tourist brochures conveniently ignored. She moved by night, a phantom gliding through the forgotten arteries of the metropolis. She learned the geography of Ethel's decay, the rust-eaten industrial zones where factories stood like skeletal remains, the sprawling junkyards that rose and fell like metallic hills, and the polluted, lightless canals that bled into the sea. The scents of her old life, polished wood and aging paper, were replaced by the acrid smells of rust, refuse, and chemical brine. This was the city's underbelly, the place where everything broken and unwanted was sent to be forgotten. For the first time since her transformation, she felt a strange sense of belonging. She too was broken. She too had been discarded. The snakes on her head adapted, their senses becoming her own. They tasted the direction of the damp, salty air, they felt the vibrations of approaching vehicles through the ground, and their collective, silent watchfulness meant she was never truly alone or unguarded. Hunger became a gnawing, unfamiliar pain. She learned to scavenge, finding discarded food behind dilapidated diners, her new, hardened stomach able to tolerate things that would have once made her ill. It was a wretched, lonely existence, a fight for every scrap of survival, but it was a life. The true test of her new reality came on a moonless, rain-slicked night near the city's shipping port. She had found shelter in the shell of a burned-out warehouse, the corrugated steel groaning in the wind. She was huddled in a corner, trying to find a moment of peace, when 3 figures appeared in the gaping doorway, their forms silhouetted against the distant city lights. They were scavengers, their faces hard and hungry, their eyes picking through the darkness for anything of value. And then they saw her. They didn't scream. In this part of the city, fear was a currency, and they were accustomed to preying on the weak. They saw a lone woman, strangely still, and they saw an opportunity. Well, well, the leader said, a cruel smile splitting his face as he took a step forward, a length of rusted pipe held like a club in his hand. Look what we have here. Lost little girl. Maria's first instinct was the one she had learned in the alleyway, fear. She pressed herself back against the wall, making herself small. Leave me alone, she rasped, her voice a dry, gravelly sound. The men chuckled, a low, menacing sound. Now, why would we do that? The leader said, advancing on her. We're just looking for a little company. As he moved closer, the snakes on her head came alive. They rose, a seething, hissing corona of reptilian fury. The men paused, their confident smiles faltering. What in the hell? One of them whispered. But the leader, emboldened by greed and cruelty, shook off his surprise. Just a freak, he snarled. Let's see what she's hiding. He lunged. And in that moment, Maria's fear and terror and a lifetime of repressed rage erupted. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She looked up, her head snapping forward, her luminous, terrible eyes locking directly with his. Time seemed to slow. She saw the cruel sneer on his face, the glint of light on the pipe, the intent in his eyes. And she felt a cold, ancient power welling up inside her, a power that flowed through her veins and focused into her gaze. The man froze mid-stride. His sneer became a frozen mask of shock, then dawning, absolute terror. A gray pallor washed over his skin, starting from his feet and racing up his body, leaching the color and life from him in a sickening, visible wave. His mouth opened in a silent scream that would never be heard. His limbs stiffened, his knuckles whitening around the pipe. In the space of 3 heartbeats, the living, breathing man was gone. In his place stood a statue. A perfect, detailed sculpture of a terrified man, rendered in cold, lifeless stone. Pipe clattered from the statue's hand, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, horrified silence. The other 2 men stared, their minds unable to process what they had just witnessed. Then a shared animal terror broke through their incomprehension. They scrambled backward, falling over each other in their haste to escape, their panicked screams swallowed by the night. Maria was left alone with the statue. The first stone. The first life she had taken. Power receded, leaving her trembling and nauseous. She looked at the man's face, his expression of eternal terror, and a profound horror at her own capabilities washed over her. She had not wanted this. She had not wanted to kill. This was not justice. This was monstrosity. She had proven Dr. Sharma right. Tumbling from the warehouse, she fled into the labyrinth of shipping containers, her mind reeling. The act had been horrifying, but a small, cold part of her mind registered the truth. It had also been a solution. It had been her only defense. As she found a new hiding place, shivering not from the cold but from the aftershocks of her own power, she began to understand. Her curse was not just a punishment, it was a weapon. Terrible, absolute weapon. And in a world that had cast her out and left her with nothing, a weapon was the only thing that might keep her alive. The whispers of the monster of the wastes would now have a name, and a legend, written in stone. The story of the stone man in the warehouse spread like a contagion through the forgotten corners of Ethel. Started with the 2 scavengers who had escaped, their words tumbling out in terrified, incoherent bursts in the dim light of a dockside bar. They spoke of a woman with a nest of serpents for hair and a gaze that stole the life from your body and turned your flesh and blood to granite. First, the tale was dismissed as the drunken fantasy of frightened men. But when a pair of cynical port officers sent to investigate the disturbance found the stone statue, its face a perfect, screaming mask of terror, the whispers solidified into something harder. Something real. The legend grew with every telling. She was a demon clawing its way up from the polluted canals. She was a failed experiment escaped from a clandestine corporate lab. She was a vengeful spirit, a boogeyman for the modern age. The details changed, but the core of the story remained the same. There was a monster in the wastes, a woman whose gaze meant a cold, permanent death. The outcasts and the forgotten, the people who lived in the city's shadow, gave her a name. It was an old word, dredged up from some forgotten folklore, a name that meant both terror and a dark kind of guardianship. They called her Medusa. Maria, hiding in the labyrinthine ruins of an abandoned chemical plant, heard the name whispered by transients huddled around a fire. Medusa. The name felt alien, a label for the monster she saw in her reflection, not for the girl she remembered being. But the name stuck. It followed her on the wind, a constant reminder of what she had become. The ghost of Maria had been a victim. Medusa was a threat. And in this brutal new world, being a threat was a form of survival. She was haunted by the statue she had created. The man's terror-filled face was seared into her memory. She had killed, and the act had irrevocably changed her. It had drawn a line between her past and her terrifying present. Now she had to understand the weapon she wielded. In the desolate, echoing halls of the chemical plant, she began to test her power. It was a horrifying process. She started with a discarded mirror, watching in terror as the glass cracked and turned a milky, opaque white under her gaze. She focused on a rat skittering across the floor and watched, sickened, as the tiny creature froze, becoming a perfect miniature gargoyle. She discovered the curse was tied to her will, her emotions. When she was calm, she could look at things without destroying them, though it took immense concentration, like holding her breath underwater. But the moment fear or anger spiked, the power would surge, her eyes would glow, and the petrifying energy would lash out, hungry and absolute. The snakes on her head were a barometer of this power, growing agitated and hissing moments before the curse was unleashed. Control was possible, but it was a fragile, exhausting state of being. She was living with a loaded gun pointed at the world, and her own emotions were the trigger. One evening, a true test of this fragile control arrived in the form of a small, shivering girl, no older than 10, who had wandered into the plant, lost and crying. The girl had a torn coat and a smudged face, and she was calling out for her mother. When she saw Medusa step out from behind a rusted vat, the girl didn't scream. She was too lost, too tired, too miserable to even process the monstrous sight before her. She just looked up with wide, tear-filled eyes. Medusa's every instinct screamed at her to act. This was a threat. A witness. The snakes on her head writhed, their hissing filling the cavernous space. Her eyes began to burn with that cold, internal light. It would be so easy. A single look and the threat would be neutralized, turned into another silent monument to her isolation. But looking at the child's innocent, terrified face, Medusa saw not a threat, but an echo of herself. A lost soul in a place of ruin. The memory of Maria, the girl who had once been just as lost inside the Athenaeum, fought against the monstrous instinct. With a gut-wrenching effort of will, Medusa squeezed her eyes shut. "Go!" she forced the word out, her voice a harsh, painful rasp. "Get out of here. Now. Don't look at me." She turned her back, every fiber of her being focused on suppressing the deadly energy that wanted to be released. She heard the girl let out a small sob and then the sound of her frantic footsteps, retreating, fading into the distance. When she was sure the child was gone, Medusa collapsed against a wall, drained and trembling. She hadn't killed. For the first time, she had controlled the curse. A small, aching part of her, the last remnant of her humanity, had won. But she knew she couldn't risk such an encounter again. She needed a true lair, a place so remote and inaccessible that no one would ever stumble upon it by accident. She found it in the sea caves carved into the cliffs at the very edge of the continent, where the polluted waters of Ethel met the vast, unforgiving ocean. The entrance was hidden, accessible only during low tide, and the caves wound deep into the rock. It was a place of damp, eternal twilight, the sound of the crashing waves a constant, mournful roar. This became her fortress, her prison, her kingdom. The few foolish bounty hunters or thrill-seekers who managed to track the legend of Medusa to her new home never left. Their stone forms became silent, eternal sentinels at the mouth of her cave, a grim garden that served as a stark warning to any who would follow. She was no longer Maria, the frightened girl running from a false goddess. She was Medusa, the whispered name, the queen of a stone kingdom. In the damp darkness of her cave, surrounded by the silent statues of her enemies and the constant sound of the sea, she waited. She had been cast out, remade, and mythologized. And she knew, with a cold certainty that mirrored the stone around her, that the world that had created her would one day come to her door again. This time, she would be ready. While the legend of Medusa took root in the cracked pavements and rusted steel of Ethel's periphery, life within the city's gleaming heart continued its elegant, unperturbed rhythm. Within the serene, marbled halls of the Athenaeum, the pursuit of knowledge remained paramount, the silence as sacred as ever. But even walls as thick and proud as these could not entirely mute the chaotic whispers of the world outside. The stories that had started in dockside bars and transient camps had grown legs, scurrying like rats into the city's mainstream. Tabloid headlines screamed of a stone gazer of the wastes. Fringe news sites posted grainy, inconclusive photos of the statues. The city's police force issued quiet, baffling reports of petrified bodies, officially labeling them as bizarre, unsolved homicides. The whispers finally became loud enough to echo in the corridors of power, reaching the ears of men like Preston. He first heard the story at an exclusive club, seated in a plush leather chair, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. He laughed it off with the easy derision of a man who believed in nothing he couldn't buy, sell, or control. "A woman with snakes for hair," he chuckled to his associates. "Sounds like the city's sanitation problems are getting out of hand. Send a memo to the mayor." He dismissed it as mass hysteria, a foolish superstition bubbling up from the uneducated masses who worked in his factories and on his shipping docks. Yet the stories persisted, and the descriptions, in their strange specificity, began to needle at him. A woman, an outcast, viciously defensive, residing in the very wastelands where the city's refuse was dumped. A tiny, unwelcome memory pricked at the edge of his consciousness. A flash of defiant green eyes, a cascade of bronze and gold hair, a girl in a simple gray robe. He pushed the thought away as ludicrous. That girl was gone. Weak. Sharma had dealt with her, till he couldn't shake a sliver of unease. This growing myth was a chaotic variable in a world he prided himself on controlling, and it annoyed him. Dr. Anya Sharma did not share Preston's skepticism. She did not need to read the tabloids, she could read the patterns. When the first official report of a petrified man crossed her desk, a security briefing sent to all major institutional heads, she knew. There was no doubt, no surprise, only a cold, grim certainty. Contamination she had cast out had not simply survived. It had metastasized. It had become a power. She felt no guilt. Guilt was a useless, sentimental emotion. What she felt was a profound intellectual fury. Her solution had been imperfect. She had banished the problem, but she had failed to eliminate it. Maria, no, the creature that had been Maria, was a living testament to a loose end, a chaotic element born of a situation Sharma had been forced to manage. The monster's very existence was an affront to her sense of order. Every stone statue it created was another crack in the pristine facade of the city she considered her domain. Preston chose to visit her one afternoon, striding into her immaculate office with his typical air of ownership. "Anya," he began, foregoing any pleasantries. "This ridiculous story about a monster in the wastes is starting to affect productivity. Workers are spooked. Shipping schedules are being delayed. Costing me money. Police are useless. I thought with your resources you might have a clearer picture of this mass delusion." Dr. Sharma looked up from a delicate ancient manuscript, her eyes as cool and gray as a winter sky. "There is no delusion, Preston," she said, her voice calm and even. "There is only a consequence that has been allowed to fester for too long." Preston's confident demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about? You think this thing is real?" "I think," Dr. Sharma said, carefully placing a weighted bookmark on her page, "that when you introduce a volatile element into a controlled system, you must be prepared for a violent reaction. You were that element. The girl, Maria, was the reaction. And the creature they are now calling Medusa is the fallout." Color drained from Preston's face. He stared at her, the memory he'd been suppressing now flooding his mind with chilling clarity. "The girl? That's impossible. She was just she ran off. She was nothing. She was nothing," Dr. Sharma agreed, her voice laced with ice. "And I remade her into something else to purify my home of the filth you brought into it. I cast her out, a monster made manifest. I had assumed the world would correct my oversight and destroy her. The world, it seems, has failed. The legend she is building is becoming a threat to the stability of this city. To my Athenaeum. And to you." The last two words hung in the air, a clear and present threat. Preston, for the first time in a very long time, felt a genuine flicker of fear. This was not a problem money could solve. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What I should have done from the beginning," Dr. Sharma replied, standing and walking to her window, which overlooked the perfectly manicured gardens of the Athenaeum. "I will correct the error. A conventional force is useless. You cannot fight a myth with bullets and handcuffs. To kill a monster, you must first create a hero, a specialist, someone who is not afraid of monsters, because they are a sharper, more effective weapon themselves." She looked out at her perfect, ordered world, her mind already working, sifting through contacts, assessing assets, formulating a strategy. She was not a goddess of wisdom. She was a goddess of absolute, ruthless order. And a creature born of chaos had been allowed to exist for far too long. The hunt for Medusa was about to begin in earnest, not with a mob of frightened citizens, but with the cold, precise, and infinitely more dangerous calculations of her creator. Dr. Anya Sharma did not deal in brute force. She dealt in precision. To eliminate the problem she had created, she required not a bludgeon, but a scalpel. Her search for this instrument was brief, discreet, and efficient, conducted through encrypted channels and shadowy intermediaries that were invisible to the public eye. The search led her to one name, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and fear in the circles of corporate espionage and black ops contracting: Jax Pierce. They called him Jax. Jax was a ghost, a professional wraith who moved through the world's most dangerous places, solving problems that officially did not exist. A former Tier 1 special operator, he had left the rigid structure of the military for the lucrative, morally ambiguous world of private contracting. He was a master of infiltration, a specialist in asset removal, and he was legendarily expensive. He was, in every sense of the word, a weapon for hire. The meeting was arranged not in some clandestine back room, but in the sterile, art-filled penthouse of a private corporate tower that Preston's company owned but had never used. The anonymity was the point. Jax arrived precisely on time, a man of medium height and build who somehow seemed to take up no space at all. He had the calm, watchful eyes of a predator and a face that was utterly forgettable, a trained asset in his line of work. He said nothing, simply stood in the center of the room, waiting. Dr. Sharma was already there, a severe figure standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of her city. "Mr. Pierce," she began, her voice as crisp as the lines of her suit. "Thank you for coming. I have a contract for you. A sanitation contract, you might call it." "I don't do janitorial," Jax replied, his voice a low, level baritone. "No," Dr. Sharma said, turning to face him. "You neutralize threats. And I have a significant one. A biological anomaly that is threatening the stability of this city. It is a woman. She is extremely dangerous and resides in the sea caves on the western cliffs." She slid a tablet across a polished marble table. On the screen was a heavily redacted file. There were satellite images of the caves, thermal scans showing a single cold-blooded heat signature within, and a list of the missing persons who had last been seen in the area, the bounty hunters and thrill-seekers who now made up Medusa's stone garden. "This anomaly," Jax said, not touching the tablet, "what makes her so dangerous?" "She has a unique defense mechanism," Dr. Sharma explained, her words carefully chosen. "Direct visual contact appears to induce a rapid, irreversible paralysis in her victims. A state that is, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from petrification. We believe it may be a neurotoxin delivered through a sophisticated aerosol, or perhaps a powerful hypnotic suggestion. The exact science is irrelevant to your objective." She was carefully omitting the more mythological details, couching the curse in the plausible, clinical language of a security briefing. Jax's expression didn't change, but a flicker of professional interest lit his eyes. This was not a standard contract. "Direct visual contact is the kill switch," he stated, processing the tactical problem. "So I can't look at her." "Precisely," Dr. Sharma affirmed. "Which is why this contract requires a specialist with a unique toolkit." She gestured to a series of hardened pelican cases resting on the table. She opened the first one. Inside, nestled in custom foam, was a sleek, matte black helmet. "This is the Aegis helmet," she said. Its visor is a solid-state composite completely opaque. There is no direct line of sight. Instead, it operates on a LiDAR and multi-spectrum imaging system. It maps the world in 3 dimensions and projects that data onto the inside of the visor. You will see her shape, her position, her every movement, but you will not see her. Your eyes will be shielded. She opened a second, longer case. Inside lay a weapon that looked like a cross between an ancient sword and a futuristic tool. It was a single long piece of polished dark gray metal, its edge seeming to disappear into infinity. This blade is forged from a proprietary tungsten carbide alloy. It is monomolecularly sharp. It will cut through anything. Body armor, bones, stone, it will not fail. Finally, she gestured to a third case containing a compact harness and several grapple launchers. The cliffs are treacherous. This will grant you the wings you need to navigate them silently and efficiently. Jax was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving over the advanced, custom-made equipment. This was not just a high-paying job. This was a state-of-the-art manhunt for a target with an almost supernatural defense. Puzzle of it, the sheer difficulty appealed to the core of who he was. "Who is she?" he finally asked. "Where did she come from?" "She is a loose end, Mr. Pierce," Dr. Sharma said coldly. "A failed experiment that needs to be decommissioned. That is all you need to know. Your objective is simple: infiltrate her lair, neutralize the target, and bring back her head as proof of termination. Your payment will be enough to ensure you never have to work again." Proof of termination. The head. A barbaric, ancient request presented with cold, corporate precision. Jax picked up the helmet, feeling its weight, its perfect balance. He looked at Dr. Sharma, the woman who spoke of monsters and decapitation with the emotionless calm of a surgeon discussing an amputation. He didn't care about her motives. He didn't care about the target's backstory. He was a professional. This was a contract. A problem to be solved with the right tools and the right skill set. "I accept your terms," he said. With that, the hero was armed. The weapon was aimed. The cold, calculated will of Dr. Sharma was now in the hands of a man who did not know he was being sent to kill not just a monster, but the tragic, shattered reflection of a girl named Maria. Jax Pierce was a man who operated on data, not emotion. His preparation was a quiet, meticulous ritual. In a sterile, anonymous safe house, he spent 36 hours immersing himself in the mission parameters. He memorized tidal charts, studied geological surveys of the cliff face, and analyzed the pathetic, grainy images of the stone statues that had been leaked online. He field-stripped and reassembled his custom-made equipment until its operation was an extension of his own muscle memory. He was not preparing to fight a woman. He was preparing to dismantle a complex security system. Target was simply the final component. His approach was executed with the same cold precision. Under the cloak of a moonless, overcast night, a black, unmarked submersible deployed him 2 miles off the coast. From there, he navigated the choppy, polluted waters in a low-profile inflatable raft, its electric motor barely a whisper above the sound of the waves. Cliffs rose before him, a sheer black wall against a starless sky, the maw of the sea caves a place of absolute darkness. To Jax, it was just terrain. A problem of elevation and access to be solved. He anchored the raft and used the grapple launcher to ascend the wet, slippery rock face. The harness was a marvel of engineering, pulling him upward with silent, powerful efficiency. He moved not like a man, but like a spider, finding purchase where it seemed none existed. He bypassed the main, tide-washed entrance to the caves, instead targeting a higher, less obvious fissure he had identified from the geological surveys. Surprise was a critical advantage, and he would not announce his arrival through the front door. He slipped through the narrow opening into the damp, chilling blackness of the cave system. The air was thick with the smell of salt, brine, and something else, a faint, musky, reptilian odor that was deeply unsettling. He didn't activate his helmet's main imaging system yet, relying on a low-light navigation mode. The first thing he encountered was not the monster, but her work. As he rounded a corner into a larger antechamber, he found them. The stone garden. They were positioned near the main entrance, a silent, grim welcoming party. There were 5 of them. Jax had seen death in every conceivable form, but this was different. This was not the aftermath of violence. This was violence preserved in its most terrifying moment. He activated the Aegis helmet's full sensor suite, and the world resolved into a ghostly, three-dimensional schematic. The statues were cold, dense shapes, their outlines rendered in cool blue tones. But the helmet's scanners were so precise he could see the texture of their clothing, the individual strands of their hair, and the raw, unadulterated terror etched onto their faces. He moved among them, a ghost examining other ghosts. One was a hulking brute, his arms still raised as if to ward off a blow. Another was a younger man, his face a mask of disbelief, his hand frozen in the act of reaching for a weapon. Jax's scanner identified the material composition: calcium carbonate and silicate minerals, but with the exact organic structure of a human body. It was a perfect, instantaneous fossilization. Dr. Sharma's clinical description had been a wild understatement of the truth. This was not a neurotoxin. This was something that broke the laws of physics. Then he saw the fifth statue. It was set slightly apart from the others. The man was dressed in the tactical gear of a high-end corporate security contractor. On the collar of his stone uniform was a small, barely perceptible logo, an interlocking P and C. Preston Corporation. Jax zoomed in on the detail, his mind making a connection that didn't fit the neat narrative he'd been given. Dr. Sharma had described the target as a lone, psychotic killer. What was one of Preston's corporate enforcers doing here, hunting her? The mission file was incomplete. He was being lied to. A professional didn't like being lied to. It meant there were unknown variables, and unknown variables were deadly. Putting the thought aside for later analysis, he pressed deeper into the cave system, his weapon now drawn. The monomolecular blade didn't reflect any light. It seemed to absorb it, a sliver of perfect darkness in his hand. The hissing started then. It was faint at first, a barely audible sibilant sound that echoed strangely off the wet rock. It was not the sound of one creature, but of many, a chorus of soft, dry whispers. He followed the sound through a narrow, winding passage and into a vast central cavern. The roar of the ocean outside was a dull, constant thunder. He stayed in the shadows, his Aegis helmet scanning the space. Cavern was large, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. There was evidence of habitation, a crude sleeping pallet made of salvaged sails, the gnawed bones of seabirds and fish. Small, humanizing details that stood in stark contrast to the monstrous legend. And then the scanner found her. A single life form, curled up on the pallet on the far side of the cavern. The helmet rendered her in a shifting, multicolored thermal outline. The data classified her as cold-blooded, her body temperature nearly matching the cool air of the cave. The hissing was coming from her, from the strange, writhing thermal mass on her head. She was asleep. Vulnerable. The objective was clear. Contract was simple. Neutralize the target. End this. Jax raised the blade, its edge humming with a silent, deadly energy. He was a professional. A ghost. He took a silent step forward, then another. The hunter had found his prey. The hero had found his monster. And in the cold, data-driven world projected on the inside of his visor, he was about to deliver the final logical solution. The blade in Jax's hand was an instrument of absolute finality. It hummed with a latent energy, ready to complete its task. Target was there, a cold-blooded thermal signature, asleep and unaware. The mission parameters were simple. The angle was perfect. His training, his experience, his entire professional ethos screamed at him to act. End it. One clean, silent stroke. But he hesitated. The hesitation was a foreign feeling, an unwelcome glitch in his internal operating system. It lasted only a microsecond, but in that sliver of time, his mind replayed the incongruous data points, the statue of the Preston Corp enforcer, a piece that didn't fit the lone wolf narrative. Crude, desperate signs of survival in this cave, which spoke less of a monster's lair and more of a refugee's camp. Dr. Sharma's cold, calculated demeanor, a little too eager to erase this failed experiment. The intelligence was compromised. And as he stood over the sleeping form, a new piece of conflicting data emerged, something his sensors were not designed to analyze. A sound. From within the tangled thermal mass on the cave floor, there came a soft, mournful whimper. Perspective shifts. The world is no longer a cold, damp cave. It is the grand library of the Athenaeum. Sunlight, warm and golden, streams through the high, arched windows, illuminating dancing dust motes. The air smells of vanilla, old paper, and lemon polish. A woman with a kind, sharp face and eyes that hold all the wisdom in the world is smiling. "Your mind is beautifully ordered, Maria," Dr. Sharma says, her voice a melody of approval. The feeling is one of peace, of belonging, of perfect logical safety. Then the light shifts, grows dim, unnatural. The scent of paper is replaced by the cloying, salty smell of a man's cologne. A voice, deep and smooth as whiskey, whispers her name. Maria. The library shelves twist and warp, the books falling, their pages turning to ash. The safe, ordered world is on fire. Dr. Sharma's kind face is still there, but it is cold now, carved from unforgiving stone. "You invited this chaos," the stone mouth says, the voice no longer a melody, but the grinding of rocks. "You are a contamination." The dream collapses into a vortex of terror. The feeling of being pinned down, the sound of tearing cloth, the suffocating darkness of the eclipse. And then the final agony, the feeling of her own hair twisting into a crown of living, venomous things. She is falling, cast out, banished into a world that screams at the sight of her. The grief is a physical weight, a crushing, absolute loneliness. A single, broken sound escaped Medusa's lips as she slept. "Maria." Jax heard it. His helmet's auditory sensors, sensitive enough to pick up a whisper from 50 yards, delivered the sound directly to his ears with perfect, chilling clarity. Maria. It was a name. A human name, spoken with an accent of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. Target was no longer a target. The biological anomaly was no longer in it. It was a she. A she with a name. A she who was dreaming, trapped in a nightmare. The entire tactical picture in Jax's mind fractured. He was a hunter, not an executioner. He dealt with threats, not with grieving women. The data on his visor showed him a monster. His ears told him he was standing over a victim. His own breathing, amplified inside the sealed helmet, seemed unnaturally loud. Perhaps it was that, or the subtle shift of his weight on the gravelly cave floor, but something disturbed the sleeper. The thermal signature on his display stirred. The writhing mass on her head, the snakes, suddenly flared with warmer, agitated colors. Their hissing, which had been a soft, dormant whisper, escalated into a sharp, threatening chorus. Medusa awoke with a start, not to a sight but to a feeling. Primal, animal certainty of being watched. Of a predator in her den. She didn't scream. Time for screaming was long past. She scrambled backward on the pallet, her strange, powerful body coiling like a spring, putting distance between herself and the dark, man-shaped void that stood in the center of her cave. In the near-absolute darkness, she couldn't make out details, only a tall, motionless silhouette where there should have been nothing. Her fear was instantaneous, but it was now welded to a cold, deadly fury. Her curse flared to life. Her eyes, which had been closed in a troubled sleep, snapped open, and they were no longer human. They were twin pools of pale, glowing, phosphorescent green, cutting through the darkness, searching for a target. The snakes on her head rose up, a terrifying, swaying crown, their forked tongues tasting the air, their lidless eyes fixed on the intruder. The standoff was absolute. The grieving girl from the dream was gone, replaced by the cornered, lethal monster from the legend. Jax stood perfectly still. His visor showed her new posture, a defensive crouch, poised to strike. He could see the thermal energy concentrating around her head and eyes. The weapon was active. The threat was live. His training took over, his body tensing, the monomolecular blade held at a perfect ready angle. Contract was clear, neutralize. Proof of her monstrosity was right in front of him, glowing in the dark. But the sound of that whispered name, the echo of that profound sorrow, was still ringing in his ears. He had come here to kill a monster. But as he faced the terrified, glowing eyes in the darkness, a new, unwelcome question lodged itself in his professional mind. What if the monster was the victim? The air in the cavern was a coiled spring of tension. Medusa remained crouched in the darkness, a silhouette of terror, her glowing eyes the only fixed points in the shifting gloom. The snakes on her head swayed, a field of living venom, their collective hiss a promise of a swift and permanent death. Opposite her, Jax stood as still as the statues outside, a man-shaped void, his blade a sliver of absolute night. His training dictated the next move, close the distance, neutralize the threat. But his training was based on clear intelligence, and the mission file was now a shredded mess of lies and contradictions. He made a tactical decision. the riskiest, most unorthodox one of his career. He chose to speak. His voice, filtered through the helmet's external speakers, was calm, impersonal, and devoid of aggression. Cut through the hissing and the distant roar of the ocean. Maria. The name struck the air and shattered the tension, but not in the way a weapon would. Medusa flinched as if physically struck. The angry glow in her eyes flickered, replaced by a wave of pure shock. The snakes on her head stilled for a moment, their agitated dance pausing. No one had spoken that name to her since the world had ended. It was a key to a lock she had long since buried. "Who are you?" she hissed, her voice a raw, gravelly thing and used to conversation. "How do you know that name?" "I heard you say it," Jax replied, his tone still level. "In your sleep." "My name is Jax. I need to ask you some questions." Medusa let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed unervingly in the vast, dark space. "Questions? You sneak into my home armed for war and you want to ask questions? Are you the most polite assassin they've ever sent?" "I'm not an assassin," Jax stated, a professional lie that was becoming truer by the second. "I'm a contractor. I was hired to eliminate a threat." "A monster," she spat the word. "Don't dress it up in your tidy corporate language. You were sent here to kill the monster. So why are you still breathing? Why haven't you looked at me?" This was the crux of it. The tactical puzzle she couldn't solve. He was different from the others. He wasn't afraid, but he was cautious. And he was still alive. Jax decided to offer a piece of information, a calculated trade to de-escalate the situation. "Because I'm not looking at you, Maria. I'm looking at a data schematic. A 3D model rendered from LiDAR and thermal imaging. My eyes are shielded. To me, you're just a ghost on a screen." The revelation stunned her. For all these lonely months, her curse had been absolute. It was her shield and her damnation. But this man, this ghost, had found a way to bypass it. He could face her without dying. The terrifying power dynamic that had defined her new existence was suddenly, fundamentally altered. He was not just another brute to be turned to stone. He was something far more dangerous, an intelligent, prepared adversary. "Then you are a coward," she snarled, trying to regain control. "Hiding behind your technology." "I'm a professional," Jax corrected her. "And my intel is faulty." Inside your cave, there's a statue of a man in a Preston Corp uniform. He doesn't fit the profile of a common bounty hunter. Why was he here? The name Preston was another spark on a trail of gunpowder. "Preston," she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "Of course. The jackal always sends his dogs to clean up his mess. He came here because his master is a coward who couldn't finish the job himself." Jax processed this. Target knew Preston. This was personal. What job? The job of erasing a mistake. Medusa shrieked, her voice cracking with a pain that was raw and timeless. The job of silencing the girl he assaulted and left for dead. The word assaulted landed in the quiet space between them with the force of a physical blow. The mission file, Dr. Sharma's clinical story of a failed experiment with a psychotic break, dissolved into dust. A psychotic break wasn't caused by an experiment, it was caused by trauma. "Tell me what happened," Jax said, his voice softer now, less the interrogator and more the investigator. "Why?" she shot back, suspicion still her primary defense. "So you can write a detailed report before you put that sword through my heart? So you can understand the monster before you kill it?" "My client," Jax said, making his final critical move, "is Dr. Anya Sharma." The other names were sparks, this one was a lightning strike. The rage and grief that Medusa had kept banked for so long erupted. "Sharma," she screamed, the name a raw wound. "That bitter, cold goddess of order. The one who watched me bleed on her precious library floor and blamed me for the stain. She called me a contamination. She judged me, cursed me, remade me into this, and then cast me out. And now she sends you her perfect sterile weapon to finally scrub the stain away. She doesn't want to neutralize a threat, you fool. She wants to bury her own sin." The story poured out of her then, a torrent of names and places and betrayals. The Athenaeum, Preston, the assault during the eclipse, and Dr. Sharma's final, terrible verdict. It was not a plea for sympathy. It was a venomous, hate-filled testimony, the truth as seen through the eyes of a woman who had been to hell and remade in its image. Jax listened, every word slotting into place, every lie in his briefing now exposed. He was not a hero sent to kill a monster. He was the cleaning crew, hired by the real monster to dispose of the evidence. His contract was a lie. His target was a victim. And his client was a villain who wielded power and lies with the precision of a surgeon. He stood in the darkness, the data on his visor showing a cold-blooded creature, but his ears hearing the story of a shattered human being. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the monomolecular blade, the tip coming to rest on the damp stone floor. His mission parameters hadn't just changed. They had been inverted. Truth, once spoken, hung in the cold, damp air of the cavern, seeming to displace the very darkness itself. Medusa's raw, pain-filled testimony echoed off the stone walls, a verdict against the woman who sat in the ivory tower of the Athenaeum. Jax stood motionless, the monomolecular blade lowered, its deadly purpose rendered obsolete. He was a man whose entire life was built on a simple, brutal code: execute the contract, eliminate the target. But that code was predicated on the integrity of the mission file. Now the file was revealed as a work of insidious fiction, and he was standing in the middle of a crime scene, pointing his weapon at the victim. Medusa watched him, her body still coiled with tension. The snakes on her head, sensing the shift in the stranger's intent, had quieted their hissing, but they remained alert, 100 pairs of lidless, unblinking eyes tracking his every move. His lowered weapon was not enough. To her, every living thing was a potential threat, every alliance a prelude to betrayal. "My contract is void," Jax finally said, his voice resonating with a new, hard edge. "The terms were based on fraudulent intelligence. My client lied. So you'll just leave?" Medusa sneered, her voice dripping with the cynicism that had become her only armor. "You'll go back to your pristine city and forget the monster in the cave? They won't let you. You know too much now. To them, you're just another loose end." "I know," Jax replied calmly. "Which means my mission has changed." He took a slow, deliberate step back, increasing the distance between them. "I can't operate on bad intel. And I can't talk to a data schematic. I need to talk to you. Maria." Hearing the name again, spoken with intent rather than as an accusation, sent a tremor through her. "Don't call me that," she whispered. "Maria is dead." "Then I need to talk to the woman they call Medusa," he countered. "But I can't do that while I'm hiding behind this helmet." He raised a hand to the side of the Aegis helmet. "I'm going to take it off. I need you to not look at my face. Turn away. Or close your eyes. My life is in your hands." Proposition was insane. A plea for trust in a place where trust had long since died. Medusa stared at the faceless man, her mind reeling. He was offering her his life, a willing sacrifice to the curse that had defined her. Why? Was it a trick? A final, desperate gambit? The snakes on her head began to hiss and writhe again, agitated by her confusion. "Why should I?" she challenged him. "Why should I trust the man they sent to kill me?" "Give me one reason." "Because I believe you," Jax said, his voice stripped of its filtered, impersonal tone, the words raw and direct. "And because right now, you and I are the only two people in the world who know the truth about what Dr. Anya Sharma really is. That makes us allies, whether you like it or not. And allies don't look each other in the eye when one of them can turn the other to stone." His logic was as sharp and undeniable as the blade he carried. They were both targets now. Her, the living evidence of a crime. Him, the compromised weapon. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was the roar of the ocean and the sibilant chorus of the snakes. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Medusa turned her head, her glowing gaze directed at the far wall of the cave. "Be quick about it," she said, her voice a low growl. Jax unsealed the helmet with a soft hiss of depressurizing air and lifted it off. For the first time, the raw, unfiltered reality of the cavern hit him. The damp chill, the overpowering smell of salt and ozone, the sheer, oppressive darkness. He saw her not as a thermal image, but as a real being. Her back was to him, but he could see the horrifying, beautiful truth of her transformation. The writhing, serpentine hair, each snake a perfect, living creature shimmering with dark, iridescent scales. The pale skin of her back and shoulders had the faint, patterned texture of a viper's belly. She was a living piece of mythology, a creature of profound terror and impossible tragedy. "You can turn around now," he said quietly. She did, slowly. Her eyes, which she kept carefully trained on his chest, were no longer glowing with rage, but were filled with a wary, fearful light. And now he could see her face. The monster from the legend was there, in the reptilian cast of her skin and the unnerving stillness of her features. But beneath it, he saw the ghost of the girl she must have been. He saw the delicate structure of her bones, the shape of her mouth, and the deep, abiding pain that radiated from her like a physical force. He met her averted gaze not with fear or revulsion, but with a steady, professional calm. For Medusa, the sight of his face was a shock. It was a human face. A face without terror or hatred. It was simply the face of a man, etched with the hard lines of a difficult life, his eyes holding hers with a grim, focused intensity. It was the first truly human contact she had experienced since the world had ended. "Dr. Sharma sent a weapon to kill a monster," Jax said, his voice now fully his own. She was right about the monster. She was just wrong about who it is. He slid the monomolecular blade into its sheath on his back. "My contract is with you now. No payment required. Consider it a professional course correction. I'm going to help you hunt the people who did this to you." The offer hung in the air. Vengeance. Justice. A purpose beyond mere survival. For months, her rage had been a poison with no outlet. Now this man, this killer, was offering to channel it, to aim it like a weapon back at the heart of the ivory tower that had condemned her. She finally lifted her gaze, her luminous, deadly eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second before he instinctively looked away. "They made me a monster," she said, her voice a low, cold promise. "It's time they learned to fear their creation." The alliance was forged not in friendship, but in the cold calculus of shared survival. The vast, damp cavern that had been Medusa's prison and sanctuary was transformed into a tactical operations center. The dynamic between them was that of two apex predators who had recognized the advantage of hunting together. The truce was fragile, the silence between them heavy with unspoken trauma and professional distance, but their purpose was now singular and sharp, to dismantle the empire of lies built by Dr. Anya Sharma and Preston. Jax was in his element. The unknown variables had been identified, and the mission could be redefined. He unpacked a ruggedized tactical tablet, its screen casting a pale, ghostly light on the cavern walls. "We plan. We gather intelligence. We strike with precision," he stated, his voice the epitome of professional calm. "Emotion is a liability. Your anger is a fuel, but my logic has to steer." "Understood." Medusa, who had been observing him from a distance, gave a slow, deliberate nod. The snakes on her head were calm, their movements fluid and watchful. "I am not the hysterical girl you were told about," she said, her voice a low rasp. "My anger is cold now. It is patient. Use it." For the first time, Jax was treating her not as a target or a victim, but as his single most valuable asset. "Tell me about the Athenaeum," he began, pulling up a satellite blueprint of the building. "Not the public version. Tell me its secrets. Security patrols, camera blind spots, access codes you might remember. Dr. Sharma's routines. Everything." The request opened a floodgate in Medusa's memory. What had once been a source of torturous, nostalgic dreams now became a weapon. She stepped closer to the glowing screen, the light catching the iridescent sheen on her skin. Her long, talon-like finger reached out and traced a path on the blueprint, a path no public record would ever show. "The archivists use a service causeway here behind the east wing," she began, her voice steady and sure. "It's not on the official security schematics. Connects the lower levels to the ventilation system. Cameras in that section are on a 48-hour loop, not live monitored." Sharma believed true security came from discipline, not just technology. She considered it an intellectual flaw to need constant surveillance. She spoke for over an hour, her memory unervingly precise. She detailed the schedules of the night guards, the frequency of their patrols, the way the old building's acoustics would carry sound in certain corridors and muffle it in others. She described Dr. Sharma's office, the hidden panel in the wall that controlled the room's environmental systems, the pressure plate under the rug before her desk, the specific blend of tea she had brought to her every day at precisely 4 p.m. She was dissecting her own beautiful memory and handing the pieces to Jax as instruments of war. Jax absorbed every detail, cross-referencing her information with the data he could pull from the city's network, building a multi-layered, three-dimensional model of the fortress. They identified their target's vulnerabilities. Preston is the first move, but not the main objective, Jax surmised, his fingers flying across the screen. He's arrogant. He's protected, but his routines are predictable. He's a creature of habit and appetite. We can use that. He's a source of leverage. He's a rabid dog, Medusa countered, her voice dropping with venom. But Sharma is the one who holds the leash. She's the real threat. Agreed, Jax said. She's the hard target. Insulated, disciplined, and she doesn't operate by normal rules. Attacking her directly is a losing move. We need to dismantle her world first. We need to shatter her sense of order. We need to show her that her monster can reach her, even in her ivory tower. A plan began to form, not a full-scale assault, but a surgical strike. A message. What is something of yours that might still be there? Jax asked. Something personal. Medusa thought for a moment. In the acolyte's quarters, there was a small, locked chest at the foot of my bed. Inside, I kept a journal. Not of feelings, of thoughts, quotations and observations. Dr. Sharma herself gave it to me. Perfect, Jax said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. I'll retrieve the journal, and we'll leave her a message in return. Calling card. Something to let her know her fortress has been breached. What kind of message? Medusa asked, the snakes on her head beginning to stir with a low, predatory hiss. Jax looked from the blueprints on his screen to the woman standing before him, a living embodiment of mythological terror and human tragedy. She remade you into a creature from a dark legend, he said. It's time we reminded her that legends have teeth. Plan was set. Jax would infiltrate the Athenaeum during the coming storm, using the service causeways Medusa had described. He would retrieve her journal and leave behind a small, terrifying token of his visit, a single, perfect, petrified white rose placed directly in the center of Dr. Sharma's immaculate desk. The dynamic in the cave was no longer hunter and hunted. It was predator and strategist. Medusa, the woman who had been confined to this dark hole, was now the key to unlocking the most secure building in the city. Her knowledge was the map, her anger was the motivation, and Jax was the weapon. The first move in their war was about to be made. The storm that fell upon Ethel that night was a thing of mythic fury. Rain came down in blinding, horizontal sheets, and thunder cracked the sky with the sound of celestial bones breaking. To the city's inhabitants, it was a nuisance, a force to be weathered behind walls and windows. To Jax and Medusa, it was the perfect accomplice. It was chaos, and they were about to deliver a carefully curated piece of it to Dr. Anya Sharma's doorstep. Before Jax departed, they performed a strange, quiet ritual in the flickering light of his tactical tablet. He had procured a single perfect white rose from a vendor in the city's lower market, its petals still soft and velvety. He held it out to her, his hand encased in a thick tactical glove. It's time, he said simply. Medusa looked at the flower, a symbol of a beauty and fragility that no longer had any place in her world. For months, her power had been a thing of terror, a panicked, defensive reflex that only brought death and horror. Now, for the first time, she was being asked to wield it with intention. To create, not just to destroy. She took a slow, calming breath, the hiss of the snakes on her head quieting to a low whisper. She focused her gaze on the rose. There was no flash of light, no sound. It was a silent, creeping transformation. The velvety softness of the petals stiffened, the vibrant life within them draining away, replaced by a pale, milky translucence. The delicate green stem hardened into something resembling jade. A single, perfect drop of rainwater that had clung to a petal froze in place, becoming a permanent, crystalline tear. In seconds, the living flower was gone, and in its place was a flawless, exquisitely detailed sculpture of a rose, beautiful and terrible and utterly, unnaturally permanent. She had turned a piece of life into a piece of her curse. She nodded at Jax. Calling card was ready. Jax moved like a shadow within the larger shadow of the storm. He navigated the churning, angry waters at the city's edge and found the storm drain outlet that Medusa had marked on his map. The raging water provided perfect cover as he slipped inside, moving against the current into the city's ancient circulatory system. The Athenaeum's service causeway was exactly where she'd said it would be, a rusted, forgotten branch of the main tunnel, its entrance obscured by a century of grime. Her voice was a calm, steady presence in his ear, fed through a secure, encrypted comms link from the cave. The locking mechanism is archaic. A simple tumbler. It will be rusted shut. It was. A moment's work with a tension tool and it groaned open. He was inside. Moving through the Athenaeum's hidden passages was a surreal experience. This was the sanctum of his enemy, a place of supposed order and intellectual purity, yet he moved through its guts like a virus, guided by the memories of the monster it had created. The third junction has a faulty camera, her voice directed. The feed loops every 48 seconds. You have a 7-second window after the image jump. The feed jumped. Jax moved. 7 seconds. He was through. Her knowledge was flawless. He ascended through the building's skeleton, his path intersecting with places from her story. To your left is the West Archive, she said, her voice tight, the emotion carefully controlled. Stay to the right wall. The floorboards there creak. He followed her instruction, the ghost of her trauma guiding his steps away from the scene of the crime. He found the acolytes' quarters, now a sterile, repurposed storage area. But in the back, behind a stack of document boxes, was the small, dark wood chest she had described. It was unlocked. Inside, resting on faded velvet lining, was a single leather-bound journal. He took it. Holding the small book, he felt the weight of the life that had been stolen, the last tangible piece of the girl named Maria. The final objective was the heart of the fortress, Dr. Sharma's office. It was a place of intimidating order and silence. Jax moved through the antechamber and disabled the security on her office door using a code Medusa had provided. Her own birth date, a cruel, ironic little detail Sharma had used, confident it would never be discovered. The office was exactly as Medusa had described it. Immaculate. A grand mahogany desk, books arranged with geometric precision, the air still and cold. He walked to the desk, his boots making no sound on the plush carpet. He placed the petrified rose directly in the center of a stack of Sharma's research papers. Contrast was jarring. The perfect, white stone flower, a symbol of unnatural permanence, resting on the documents of a woman who believed she had absolute control over the natural order of things. It was a whisper of a threat. Promise of chaos. His exfiltration was as silent and seamless as his entry. He melted back into the storm, the journal tucked safely away. He returned to the sea cave as the first hints of dawn began to break, the storm finally exhausting itself. He handed the journal to Medusa. She took it, her strange, stony fingers tracing the embossed title, her own neat handwriting from another lifetime. She did not open it. It was not a relic for nostalgic tears. It was proof. Proof of who she had been, and a reminder of why she was now fighting. The message had been delivered. The first move on the board had been made. Now, all they had to do was wait for the queen to realize that a serpent had found its way into her perfect, walled garden. The morning after the storm was deceptively calm. The sky over Ethel was washed clean, and the city gleamed with a renewed, rain-slicked brilliance. Inside the Athenaeum, the familiar, hallowed silence had been restored. Dr. Anya Sharma began her day with the same unvarying discipline that governed her entire existence. She arrived at her office at precisely 7 a.m., her mind already focused on the day's agenda, a budget review, a meeting with the acquisitions board, and the final edits on a monograph she was writing on pre-Socratic philosophy. Order, precision, control. These were the pillars of her world. And then she saw it. It sat in the exact center of her vast mahogany desk, a stark, pale object placed upon a stack of meticulously aligned papers. A white rose. Her mind, an engine of logic and pattern recognition, immediately registered the series of impossibilities. Her office had been locked and sealed. The security protocols were absolute. Nothing and no one entered without her knowledge. And yet, here was this object. As she drew closer, she saw the true nature of the impossibility. The rose was not made of silk or porcelain. It was stone. The texture, the delicate veins on the petals, the single crystalline drop of water frozen on its edge, it was a perfect, instantaneous fossil. It was the signature of her monster. There was no panic. Dr. Sharma did not possess the capacity for such a chaotic emotion. Instead, a wave of pure, cold fury washed through her. The message was brutally clear. I can reach you, can enter your sanctuary. Your walls mean nothing. Your order is an illusion. This was not the act of a feral creature hiding in a cave. This was an intelligent, calculated intrusion, an act of psychological warfare. Her mind immediately leaped to the next logical conclusion. The weapon she had aimed at this problem, Jax Pierce, had not reported in. His 24-hour check-in window had passed in silence. He was a ghost, and now he was gone. Conclusion was inescapable and infuriating. Her scalpel had not just failed to excise the tumor, it had switched allegiances and was now working for the disease. She had been betrayed, outmaneuvered, and mocked. She walked to her secure comms unit, her movements as precise and deliberate as always, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the back of her chair. She bypassed the standard channels and initiated a top-level encrypted call. Preston's face appeared on the screen, a picture of a man enjoying his morning coffee, the city's skyline gleaming behind him. "This had better be important, Anya," he began, his tone one of easy entitlement. "Our problem has evolved," Dr. Sharma stated, her voice flat and cold, cutting through his casual demeanor. "The asset I contracted to eliminate the target has been compromised. In fact, I believe he is now working with her." Preston's smile vanished. "What? That's impossible. Pierce is the best. The best can be bought or diluted or simply fail," she retorted. "The distinction is irrelevant. The result is the same. Last night, my office in the Athenaeum was breached. The monster sent a message. She has an accomplice who can walk through my security like a ghost. This is no longer a containment issue, Preston. This is an active insurgency. An insurgency that can trace its origins directly back to you." The veiled threat struck home. Preston's face, usually flush with confidence, turned pale. "What do you want me to do? Send in my corporate teams? He'll see them coming a mile away. She'll turn them into a new rock garden. Your brutish security forces are useless," Dr. Sharma said with disdain. "This is no longer a matter for deniable assets and quiet solutions. We tried to excise this problem with a scalpel. Now we must cauterize the wound with fire." "What are you talking about?" Preston asked, his voice strained. "I am talking about changing the rules of the game," she explained, her eyes glittering with a chilling strategic light. "We can no longer treat this as our private secret. We are going to make it the city's crisis. We are going to craft a new narrative. Not of a tragic, cursed girl, but of an imminent, terrifying threat. An escaped subject of a military experiment. A bioterrorist with a unique and deadly weapon. We will use your media connections and my institutional credibility. We will leak doctored files, fabricated eyewitness accounts. We will whip this city into a state of absolute terrified panic." Preston stared at her, horrified and yet mesmerized by the sheer, ruthless brilliance of her plan. "You want to turn the whole city against her? To what end?" "To the end of justifying a response that is absolute," Dr. Sharma concluded. "When the public is screaming for protection, they will not question the methods used to provide it. Police, the city's tactical units, even the National Guard if necessary. We will authorize a citywide manhunt. We will turn every citizen into a potential informant. We will hunt her not as a secret, but as a public enemy. There will be nowhere for her or her new accomplice to hide. I am going to set this entire city on fire to ensure our problem is burned to ashes within it." She ended the call before he could reply. Her decision was made. Private war was over. A public one was about to begin. She picked up the petrified rose, its cold, hard surface a mockery of the life it once held. It was a beautiful, defiant message. Her response would be to unleash an ugly, overwhelming force. She had received their whisper. The world was about to hear her roar. In the 2 days following the infiltration, an uneasy quiet settled in the sea cave. It was the tense, watchful silence of a ceasefire, not of peace. Jax meticulously cleaned and recalibrated his equipment, his movements economical and precise. Medusa spent hours with the journal, not reading it cover to cover, but holding it, her strange, stony fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. It was an anchor, a piece of evidence from a life she could barely remember, proof that the girl named Maria had once existed. They spoke little, their communication pared down to the tactical and the necessary. They were two weapons, waiting for the enemy to make the next move on the board. They both knew the response would come. They had expected a targeted strike, perhaps another, more heavily armed team of contractors or a discreetly placed explosive. They had prepared for a direct, physical assault. What they had not prepared for was the sheer, insidious brilliance of Dr. Sharma's counterattack. Began not with a bang, but with a flicker on the screen of Jax's tactical tablet. He was monitoring citywide communications, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever, when his brow furrowed slightly. "Unusual police chatter," he said, his voice low. "Coordinated patrol shifts. They're mobilizing the city's emergency broadcast network." Medusa looked up from the journal, the snakes on her head stirring. "Why?" "I don't know," Jax admitted. "It's not a weather event. Not a natural disaster." He rerouted a broadcast feed to his screen. A local news program was abruptly interrupted by a stark red banner. "Emergency alert," a message from the mayor's office. The face of Ethel's mayor, a man whose campaigns had been heavily funded by Preston Corp, appeared on the screen. His expression was grim, his voice filled with a carefully rehearsed gravity. "My fellow citizens," he began, "it is with a heavy heart that I must inform you of an emerging and credible threat to our city's safety." Behind him, an image flashed on the screen. It was a heavily doctored security photo, blurry and indistinct, showing a cloaked figure with a horrifying, distorted face. "Early this morning," the mayor continued, "city officials were briefed on a containment failure at a private, high-security research facility on the city's outskirts. A subject, known only as Subject M, has escaped. This individual is the result of an illegal bioweaponry program and is considered armed, psychologically unstable, and extremely dangerous." Another image appeared, a fabricated government document stamped classified, detailing the subject's unique biochemical weapon, an airborne agent that causes instantaneous, rigid paralysis. "Subject M is identifiable by several extreme body modifications," the mayor said, his voice dropping, "including reptilian skin grafts and most notably a series of animatronic serpentine appendages fused to her scalp." Medusa stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. Animatronic appendages. A bioweapon. Terrorist. They were not just lying. They were methodically, brilliantly, and publicly erasing every last shred of her truth and replacing it with a narrative of pure, manufactured evil. Jax's face was a mask of cold fury. "Sharma," he whispered. "She's not just hunting us. She's creating a mythology to do it." The report wasn't finished. Jax's image flashed on screen next, a grainy photo from his military days. "We have also confirmed that Subject M is being aided by a rogue mercenary, Jax Pierce," the mayor announced. "Pierce is a highly trained former special operator, and he is to be considered an equal threat. A substantial citywide reward is being offered for any information leading to their capture. Do not attempt to approach them. This is not a matter for heroism, it is a matter for law enforcement. See something, say something. Your city is counting on you." The broadcast ended, leaving a chilling silence in the cave, a silence soon broken by the distant, unmistakable sound of a helicopter's rotors. Jax's tablet came alive with new information. Police boats were being deployed to patrol the western coastline. Thermal imaging drones were being launched. Their cave, their remote, forgotten sanctuary, was no longer a secret. It was now designated as Search Grid Alpha. Medusa felt a surge of incandescent rage, so powerful it was almost blinding. They had taken her life, taken her identity, taken her humanity, and now they were taking her story, twisting it into a grotesque lie to be fed to the entire world. The snakes on her head writhed and hissed, a furious, living crown of her own agony. "She's turning the whole world against us," Medusa whispered, her voice trembling with a rage that was colder and deeper than any she had felt before. "Worse," Jax corrected, his eyes scanning the incoming tactical data. "She's not turning the world against us. She's turning it into her weapon. Every citizen with a phone is now her soldier. Every police officer is her pawn. We can't fight an entire city." The sound of the helicopter grew louder, a steady, rhythmic chopping that vibrated through the stone of the cave. It was getting closer. Time for planning, for hiding, for waiting was over. Their surgical strike had been answered with a declaration of total war. The walls of the world were closing in. "We have to leave," Medusa said, the words a statement of cold, hard fact. She closed the journal and tucked it into a salvaged canvas bag. It was the only thing she would take. Jax was already packing his gear, his movements swift and efficient. He looked towards the mouth of the cave, where the gray light of the outside world was now being intermittently sliced by the beam of a searchlight. "You're right," he said, his voice grim. "Hiding is no longer an option." He looked back at her, the professional killer and the mythical monster, two fugitives against the world. "Now we fight back." The thumping of the helicopter rotors was a physical force, a hammer beating against the stone of their sanctuary. The powerful searchlight sliced through the darkness at the cave's mouth, a searing white blade that swept back and forth, hunting for them. There was no time for deliberation. Every second they remained, the net grew tighter. "There's another way," Medusa said, her voice urgent. She pointed not towards the sea-swept main entrance, but back into the deepest recess of the cavern, to a fissure half hidden by a rockfall. An old smuggler's route. It leads up into the cliffs. It was their only chance. Jax took the lead, his gear stowed, his movements swift and silent. Passage was impossibly tight, a claustrophobic crawl space that scraped against his shoulders. Behind him, Medusa moved with an unnerving, fluid grace, her powerful serpentine body perfectly adapted to the narrow, twisting tunnel. They moved upward, through the cold, living rock, the sound of the helicopter fading beneath them, replaced by the frantic beating of their own hearts. They emerged an hour later, halfway up the cliff face, hidden by an overhang of rock, the wind and rain whipping at them. Below, the scene was one of organized chaos. Police boats with flashing blue lights cut through the dark water, converging on the cave. The helicopter hovered like a dragonfly of prey. They had escaped the cage just as the door was slamming shut. Their home, the only place of safety Medusa had known, was lost to them forever. There was no time for mourning. They had to disappear. They did not flee into the wilderness, where drones and thermal scanners would surely find them. Instead, they went back into the beast's belly. Under the cover of the dying storm, they slipped back into the city, becoming ghosts within its forgotten infrastructure. This was Medusa's territory. She, who had been cast out of the City of Light, had become a master of its darkness. She led Jax through a network of storm drains, maintenance tunnels, and abandoned subway lines that crisscrossed the city like a secret subterranean web. For 2 days, they were rats in a maze, moving silently beneath the feet of a populace that was being taught to hunt them. They finally found a new, temporary sanctuary in a deafeningly silent, dust-choked abandoned metro station, 3 levels beneath the city's bustling financial district. It was a concrete tomb, a relic of a failed expansion project from decades past. Here they were insulated, invisible. Here they could finally assess the new battlefield. Jax set up his tablet, powering it with a portable battery pack, and the full scope of Dr. Sharma's war flooded the screen. It was even worse than they had imagined. News channels ran their faces on a constant loop, under the ominous heading, "City Under Siege." So-called experts, undoubtedly on Preston's payroll, were brought on to analyze the threat, speaking of bioterrorism and rogue state actors. They showed fabricated psychiatric evaluations for Subject M, detailing a history of violence and delusion. They painted Jax as a mercenary who had turned handler, a puppet master for the monster. "They're not just lying," Medusa said, her voice a low, venomous whisper as she watched a news anchor describe her as a threat to our children. "They are erasing me. Erasing Maria. They are making the world hate a ghost." Jax watched the public reaction through social media feeds and police scanners. Fear was a virus and it was spreading fast. Citizens were calling in hundreds of false sightings, reporting any woman with unusual hair, any man who looked out of place. The city's fear had been weaponized. "We can't win this fight in the physical world," Jax stated, his eyes intent on the screen. "They have an army. We have a cave's worth of supplies and the clothes on our back. We can't outfight them. So we have to outthink them." "How?" Medusa asked, the snakes on her head writhing in a display of her own frustrated rage. "They control everything everyone sees and hears." "Not everything," Jax countered, a new, determined light in his eyes. He began typing, his fingers a blur across the tablet screen. "They control the broadcast, the centralized systems. But the city is also a network, a web of information. You can't control every strand. If you push on the right one, the whole web shudders. His plan was audacious. He couldn't fight Sharma's narrative, so he would attack the idea of narrative itself. He wouldn't try to tell their whole story. He would simply make the city question the story they were being told. He bypassed the major news networks and instead targeted a network of digital advertising billboards that Preston's own media conglomerate controlled, finding a backdoor in their archaic scheduling software. "Get ready," he said. Across the city, in the bustling, brightly lit Central Plaza, the public was being inundated with fear. The massive digital screens that wrapped the buildings flashed with the faces of Medusa and Jax, next to the words "armed and dangerous." And then, for 10 seconds, every screen went black. A moment of confused silence fell over the plaza. Then, new text appeared in simple, stark white letters on every screen, visible for miles. It was not an explanation. It was not a plea. It was a question. "They told you a monster escaped. Did they tell you who built the cage?" Before the system operators could react, the screens went black again. Then, the regular fear-mongering advertisements returned. But it was too late. The message had been delivered. Thousands of people had seen it. Cell phone videos were already spreading like wildfire. The first crack in Dr. Sharma's perfect, monolithic wall of lies had appeared. Down in the darkness, the ghosts in the machine had just sent their first whisper back to the world. And it was a whisper that would be impossible to ignore. The cryptic question that flashed across the billboards of Ethel vanished in seconds, but its ghost remained. In their subterranean hideout, Jax and Medusa watched the digital shockwaves spread. On social media, the clip of the hijacked screens went viral. People who had passively accepted the terrifying official narrative were now, for the first time, asking questions. The hashtag #WhoBuiltTheCage began to trend, a tiny digital rebellion against the monolithic story they had been fed. The news channels, after a moment of stunned silence, dismissed the event as a malicious prank by an anarchist hacker collective, but the damage was done. A seed of doubt had been planted in the public mind. Dr. Sharma watched this unfold from her office in the Athenaeum, her face a mask of cold fury. The attack was an intellectual insult. It was a graffiti scrawl on her perfectly curated masterpiece of fear. She had built a narrative of absolute certainty, and with a few simple words, Jax and the monster had sullied it with the most dangerous contaminant of all, nuance. Her response was swift and brutal. She advised the mayor's office that the hack was proof that the fugitives were more sophisticated and dangerous than previously imagined. She used the very doubt they had created as justification for an iron fist. The city's response escalated overnight. Checkpoints, manned by heavily armed tactical police, sprang up on major transit routes. Roving patrols began sweeping through the city's derelict zones, rousting the homeless and the disenfranchised, searching for any sign of the fugitives. The physical dragnet tightened, turning the city into a pressurized container. Watching the footage of these aggressive police sweeps, Medusa felt an unexpected pang of responsibility. These people, the ones being harassed and displaced, were the forgotten of Ethel. They were the citizens of the shadows she had once lived among. They were being punished in the hunt for her. "They're hurting them to find us," she said, her voice a low growl. The snakes on her head mirrored her agitation, their movements sharp and angry. Jax looked up from his screen, where he was monitoring the escalating police movements. "It's a classic tactic. Squeeze the population until they give up the insurgents." "But these people aren't insurgents," Medusa countered. "They're just trying to survive. They hate the city's enforcers as much as we do. And maybe more." A new thought, a new strategy began to form in her mind. "You're fighting a war in the digital world, Jax. But there's another battlefield down here. In the streets. These people, they could be our eyes and ears. They see everything the cameras miss." Jax considered it. It was a huge risk. But their current situation was unsustainable. They were trapped, burning through limited supplies with the walls closing in. "An underground intelligence network," he mused. "It's dangerous. But it could work. If you can convince them not to turn you in for the reward money." "The city offers them money," Medusa said, a grim certainty in her eyes. "I can offer them something else. A chance to fight back." Plan was perilous. Under the cover of deepest night, Medusa prepared to venture out. She couldn't hide her form, but she could obscure it, wrapping herself in a heavy, hooded trench coat salvaged from a forgotten locker, her serpentine hair carefully bundled and hidden within the deep cowl. She was a figure of shadow and menace, but she was their only diplomat. Guided by Jax through an earpiece, she navigated the labyrinthine tunnels to a known gathering point for the city's outcasts, a vast, abandoned boiler room beneath a defunct hospital. A small community had formed there, huddled for warmth and safety. As she entered, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. They recognized her instantly from the news broadcasts. Fear and suspicion radiated from them. An old man, his face a roadmap of hard living, stepped forward. He held up a hand to the others who were about to flee. "The monster," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "They say you're a terrorist." Medusa slowly lowered her hood. In the flickering firelight, the sight of her snake hair and pale, scaly skin was terrifying, yet she did not make a move of aggression. "They say many things," she replied, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "They call me Subject M, a bioweapon. They have offered a fortune for my capture." She paused, her glowing eyes scanning the faces of the frightened outcasts. "But before they gave me that name, I had another. Out on the waste, some of you had a name for me. You called me Medusa." A flicker of recognition. They remembered the legend from before the media storm. The monster that only hurt those who came looking for trouble. "The police are sweeping your homes," Medusa continued, her voice resonating with a shared sense of injustice. "They are pushing you further into the dark because of the lies they are telling about me. They lie about me just as they lie about you. They call you vagrants, criminals, drains on the system. They make the world hate you so they can ignore you. Dr. Sharma and Preston, they are the ones who built my cage. And they are the ones who built yours. I am not your enemy." She stood before them, vulnerable in her own monstrous way. She was not a terrorist. She was one of them. The ultimate outcast. The old man looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. "The city hunts you, and so they hunt us," he said. "What is it you want from us?" "Information," Medusa said. "You see what happens on the streets. Police movements, patrol routes, checkpoints. You are a network. You are the city's ghosts. Help me and I will help you. When I am done with Sharma and Preston, the people who treat this city like their personal chessboard, perhaps there will be less reason for any of us to hide in the dark." A fragile truce was born in that boiler room. They couldn't offer her an army, but they could offer her thousands of pairs of eyes. They could be her intelligence network, her spies in the war for the truth. As Medusa slipped back into the tunnels to return to Jax, she was no longer just a fugitive. She was the reluctant, monstrous leader of a shadow rebellion, a legend not of fear but of defiance. Cracks in Sharma's facade were spreading, and now an army of ghosts was emerging to help tear it down. The city's shadows began to speak. The fragile alliance Medusa had forged in the boiler room blossomed into a full-fledged underground intelligence network. Information, the most valuable currency in their desperate war, began to flow. Came in trickles at first, then in a steady stream, a river of whispers from the city's forgotten population. Cryptic messages would appear on a secure, anonymous message board Jax had created. A homeless man selling newspapers would slip a folded note to a contact. A street artist would embed a coded warning in their latest graffiti tag. 2 tactical vans just left Precinct 7, heading west. Checkpoint on the industrial bridge is checking cargo trucks, ignoring personal vehicles. Sharma's personal security detail doubled. They're nervous. For Jax and Medusa, deep in their new subterranean sanctuary, this information was a lifeline. They were no longer blind and deaf, reacting to the enemy's moves. Now they could see the hunters approach before they even arrived. They moved their hideout twice, narrowly evading sweeping patrols that were acting on stale intelligence. They watched on Jax's tablet as heavily armed police stormed a derelict warehouse they had vacated only hours before. The citywide dragnet was still active, but it was now chasing ghosts. The psychological pressure began to reverse. For the first time, it was the hunters, not the hunted, who were growing frustrated. With the immediate threat of capture lessened, Jax was able to plan their next offensive in the information war. "The first message was a crack in the wall," he said, his eyes glowing in the light of his screen. "Now we need to take a sledgehammer to it. We need to give them more than a question. We need to give them proof." "Proof of what?" Medusa asked. She was studying her journal. the pages filled with the elegant, thoughtful handwriting of a person she no longer was. The world won't believe the truth of what happened to me. It's too fantastic. Too monstrous. You're right, Jax agreed. We can't prove the myth. Not yet. But we can prove that our enemies are liars. If we can discredit the messenger, the message dies. Sharma is insulated, but Preston is a businessman. And businessmen leave a paper trail. He began to work, his fingers flying across his keyboard, seeking a digital crack in the fortress of Preston Corporation. I need a starting point. Something specific. A date, a name, a keyword. Their servers are a fortress. Medusa closed her eyes, forcing herself back into the memories of the Athenaeum. She saw Preston, his arrogant smile, his conversations with Sharma. Most of it was meaningless pleasantries, but one memory stood out. There was a period, she said slowly, about a month before everything. He was agitated. He visited the Athenaeum 3 times in 1 week. They spoke in hushed tones. I heard a few words. The harbor expansion. And environmental impact report. Sharma looked displeased. It was all Jax needed. Harbor expansion. Keyword. A date range. It was a digital key. For hours, he worked, navigating firewalls and bypassing security protocols. And then he found it. Buried deep in a subfolder on a forgotten server was a draft of an internal memo, written by one of Preston's chief engineers. The memo was a smoking gun. Detailed a catastrophic failure in the structural integrity of Preston's new harbor expansion, warning that a full collapse was imminent and unavoidable, and that the resulting chemical spill from the stored materials would be an ecological disaster. A second document, dated 2 days later, showed a massive illicit payment made to the city inspector who had signed off on the project. Preston knew. He had bribed an official to cover up a looming catastrophe that would poison the city's coastline for a generation. This is it, Jax breathed. This is the sledgehammer. Their target was Preston's flagship media network, PNN, during its highest-rated evening news program, Ethel on Alert, a show that had been dedicated almost exclusively to fear-mongering about Subject M. As the show's grim-faced host began a segment detailing the terrorist profile of the fugitives, Jax launched the attack. On millions of screens across the city, the host's face froze, pixelated, and then vanished, replaced by a stark black screen. The silence lasted for 3 seconds. Then the first document appeared, the engineer's damning memo, its warnings of an imminent collapse highlighted in red. A moment later, it was replaced by the record of the illicit payment to the city inspector. The documents vanished, and new text faded onto the screen, white against the black background. Preston Corp poisoning your water. Lying to your faces. What else are they lying about? Hashtag who built the cage. The feed was cut. The screens returned to a panicked, flustered news anchor trying to dismiss the event as a technical glitch. But it was too late. The Ghost Network had done its work, spreading screenshots and clips of the broadcast across the internet. The narrative was shattered. Public now had concrete, undeniable proof that the man funding the manhunt, the man whose media empire was telling them who to fear, was a corrupt liar who had endangered their entire city. Question on the screen was no longer a cryptic riddle. It was a legitimate, terrifying inquiry. If he lied about this, what else was he lying about? Down in their concrete tomb, Medusa and Jax watched the digital firestorm they had unleashed. They hadn't told the world her story yet. They had simply forced the world to finally question the story of the men who had created her. The city of Ethel was a hornet's nest that Jax and Medusa had kicked. The revelations about Preston Corp's corruption spread faster and burned hotter than any fire. Public trust in the city's leadership, and in the carefully crafted monster narrative, was in freefall. Protesters, spurred by a potent mix of environmental outrage and anti-corporate fury, gathered daily outside Preston's gleaming corporate tower. The hashtag who built the cage was now being chanted on the streets. The official manhunt was still technically active, but it was losing its momentum, bogged down by a credibility crisis. For Preston, the situation was a catastrophe. He was a man drowning in consequences. His company's stock was plummeting. Federal investigators were circling. He was hemorrhaging money and, more importantly, control. He called Dr. Sharma, his voice not of a confident partner but of a panicked, cornered man. This is your fault, Anya, he raged over the encrypted line. Your monster, your failed cleanup operation. My empire is burning because of a ghost you were supposed to handle. Dr. Sharma listened to his tirade with the detached patience of a biologist observing a frantic, lesser creature. His panic was predictable. It was also a liability. Her alliance with Preston had been a tool of convenience, and it had ceased to be convenient. Your incompetence in creating this mess, as you call it, is the source of this problem, Preston, she replied, her voice cutting through his hysteria with surgical coldness. You were a blunt instrument. Now you are a noisy one. Our association is concluded. Handle your own fires. She severed the connection, metaphorically and literally cutting him loose. Preston was on his own. She had a more important problem to solve. Public relations war was lost. Jax Pierce and the monster had proven too adept at fighting in the shadows of the network. Therefore, she would force them out of the shadows and into the light, onto a battlefield of her own choosing. She needed bait. Not for the cold, logical mercenary, but for the wounded, raging girl she knew was still lurking inside the monster. A press release was issued from the Athenaeum the next day. It was an announcement of profound cultural significance, framed in the language of progress and renewal. Dr. Sharma announced a major archival restoration project. To protect the institution's priceless collections from potential biocontamination, a clear reference to the official fugitive story, certain wings would be sanitized and permanently sealed. Press release specifically mentioned the West Archive and the former Acolytes' quarters, places where Maria had lived, worked, and been destroyed. When the news reached their hideout, Jax saw the trap immediately. No, he said, his voice flat. It's a lure. Too perfect, too public. She's inviting us in. The Athenaeum will be a kill box. But for Medusa, the news was not a tactical problem. It was a declaration of war on her very existence. Sharma wasn't just sealing a wing, she was burning a ghost. She was systematically erasing the last physical evidence that the girl named Maria had ever drawn breath, turning her life and her tragedy into an unpersoned, unstoried void. Cold, patient anger that had sustained her for months suddenly ignited into a white-hot, singular rage. She will not do this, Medusa whispered, the snakes on her head rising, a furious, agitated crown. She will not burn my memory. This is what she wants, Jax argued, his voice intense. She wants to provoke you, to make you emotional, reckless. We're winning the information war. We can expose her without setting foot in there. You don't understand, Medusa shot back, her glowing eyes fixing on him with a terrifying intensity. She held up the journal he had retrieved for her. This book is full of her words, her praise, her philosophy. She taught me that knowledge is sacred, that history is the only thing that's real. And now she's going to burn it all to cover her tracks? To pretend I never existed? No, this isn't about tactics anymore. This is about truth. Chasm between them was suddenly vast. He saw a tactical error. She saw an act of soul murder. I am going, she stated, her voice leaving no room for debate. That is my story in those halls, and I will not let her be the one to write the final chapter. Jax saw the unwavering resolve in her eyes. It was the same defiant fury he'd first seen in the cave, the spirit that had refused to be broken. He knew he couldn't stop her. And he knew with absolute certainty that he could not let her go alone. The logical, professional part of him screamed that this was suicide. But his own broken code of conduct had been rewritten in that cave. His contract was with her now. He let out a slow, heavy breath, the decision made. Okay, he said, his voice grim. Then we're not going in to stop her. We're not going in to retrieve anything. He began to pull up the blueprints of the Athenaeum, his mind already shifting from evasion to assault. We are going in to end this. We are walking into her trap. And we're going to turn her kill box into her tomb. The final confrontation was no longer a distant possibility. It was an imminent reality. They were returning to where it all began. The serpent was going back to the garden, not to hide or to flee, but to face its creator and to burn the whole pristine, corrupt, beautiful place to the ground. The Athenaeum at night was a different creature. It was no longer a sanctuary of light and knowledge, but a mausoleum of shadows and secrets. Every statue seemed to watch with accusing eyes. Every echo sounded like a footstep of pursuit. Dr. Sharma had prepared her fortress. The usual security was replaced by a small, silent team of elite mercenaries, men who moved with the predatory grace Jax recognized instantly. They were not police, they were killers loyal only to Sharma's vast fortune. Jax and Medusa moved through the service causeways, the familiar path now a gauntlet. "Two hostiles, second-floor rotunda," Jax whispered, his senses on high alert. "They're waiting for us." Confrontation was swift and brutal. Jax moved in a blur of motion, a ghost of violence, disabling one mercenary with a series of precise, non-lethal strikes. But the second man was faster, cornering Jax behind a marble column, laying down a burst of suppressive fire. They were pinned. "Medusa now!" Jax yelled. It was the first time she had been called upon to use her curse as a weapon in concert with him. She peered around the edge of the column. The mercenary, seeing her, raised his weapon, his face a mask of aggression. She met his gaze. There was no rage in her heart, only a cold, deadly focus. The man's movements became sluggish, then stopped entirely. Color drained from his skin as if sucked out by a vacuum, his expression of violent intent locking into a permanent, stony grimace. He stood for a second, a perfect statue, before the weight of his own petrified form caused him to topple with a deafening crash that echoed through the silent halls. Path was clear. They pressed on, deeper into the heart of the building, when a figure stumbled out from a side office. It was Preston. His suit was rumpled, his face pale with sweat and fear. He had clearly come to plead with Sharma, a last desperate act of a drowning man. He saw Jax first, and then he saw Medusa. The recognition in his eyes was instant, followed by a wave of primal, abject terror. He opened his mouth to scream, but only a choked, pathetic sound came out. Here he was, the architect of her ruin, the man whose appetites had set the world on fire. Jax stepped back, his weapon lowered, granting her the silence and space for the verdict she had earned the right to deliver. The snakes on Medusa's head writhed, their hissing a symphony of her rage. This was the moment she had dreamed of. The moment of justice. She looked at him, this trembling, broken shell of a man, stripped of his power and his arrogance, reduced to nothing more than raw fear. And she felt nothing. The white-hot rage she had expected was gone, replaced by a vast, cold emptiness. Turning him to stone felt too simple, too clean. It was an ending, and he didn't deserve an ending. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She took a step towards him, and he scrambled backward, falling to the floor. "You don't get the mercy of a quick death. You will live. You will live, and you will watch the world you built crumble to dust around you. You will answer for what you've done, not to me, but to them." She gestured vaguely to the world outside. "That will be your prison, not stone." She turned her back on him and walked away, leaving him sobbing on the polished marble floor. She was not an instrument of vengeance. She was a survivor. Their final destination was the Grand Library. And there, standing in the center of the vast, silent room, was Dr. Anya Sharma. She was not flanked by guards. She was alone, perfectly composed, a queen in her court of silent books. "So," Dr. Sharma said, her voice calm, "the flaw returns, bringing its chaos with it." "I came back for my story, Anya," Medusa replied, her voice resonating with a strength Maria had never possessed. "The one you tried to erase." "Stories can be edited," Sharma said coldly. "Flaws can be corrected." She gestured to the perimeter of the room. A series of emitters, hidden amongst the shelves, hummed to life with a low, thrumming sound. A sonic frequency tuned to the specific neurology of your condition. It will render you helpless. And a series of focused UV lasers. A reflection of your own curse, in a way. I theorize that the same energy that projects from your eyes can be used to destroy you. A fittingly ordered and scientific end. The sonic field erupted, a high-pitched, disorienting wave of energy. The snakes on Medusa's head recoiled, writhing in agony. Jax lunged for the control panel, but Sharma was ready, and a final, hidden mercenary intercepted him. Two men engaged in a desperate, silent struggle. Medusa was on her own, trapped in a field of sonic pain. But this was her library. She knew its every secret. Staggering, her vision blurring, she lunged not for Sharma, but for the base of a towering 20-foot bookshelf. With a roar that was a mix of human and something wilder, she put her full, monstrous strength into it. The massive shelf groaned, tilted, and then crashed down, severing the power cables to the emitters on that side of the room. The sonic field collapsed. Medusa rose, her head clearing, and faced her creator. Sharma, for the first time, showed a flicker of surprise, a crack in her perfect composure. She activated the laser grid, beams of intense light crisscrossing the room. Medusa moved with a deadly grace, using the toppled shelves as cover, her knowledge of the library's layout allowing her to anticipate the grid's firing pattern. She was no longer a frightened acolyte, she was a predator in her own hunting ground. She cornered Sharma near the central reading desk, the place where Maria had spent so many happy hours. Sharma stood her ground, unrepentant to the last. "You are still a monster," she hissed. "An anomaly." Medusa looked at the woman who had unmade her, the source of all her pain. She had the power to end her, to turn her to stone, to give her the fate she so richly deserved. But as she looked into Sharma's cold, unyielding eyes, she realized the ultimate victory was not to become the monster Sharma had named her. "No," Medusa said. "I am not a monster. I am a consequence." She did not kill her. She left her there, surrounded by the ruins of her perfect, ordered world. Jax, having dispatched the final guard, had already uploaded their entire story, the journal, the corporate files, his own testimony, to every news outlet and law enforcement agency in the world. The Athenaeum was surrounded. Dr. Sharma's reign was over. A life spent in a real prison, her reputation destroyed, her life's work a symbol of scandal and hubris, that was a fate far worse than stone. They slipped away in the chaos, two ghosts vanishing back into the night. The world changed. Preston Corp collapsed. Dr. Sharma was tried and imprisoned. The Athenaeum was shuttered, a monument to a terrible secret. The legend of the monster of Ethel faded, replaced by the tragic, true story of a girl named Maria. Far from the city, in a quiet, remote place where the mountains met the sea, Medusa found a different kind of sanctuary. Curse was not broken. Her hair was still a crown of serpents, her skin still pale and strange. But the rage in her heart had cooled, replaced by a quiet, resilient peace. Jax was with her. His contract was over, but his mission had found a new purpose. They were two broken people, a fallen hero and a remade monster, who had found in each other a shared solitude. Their future was a blank page, but for the first time since a long-ago day in a sunlit library, it was theirs to write.